Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Tonight we are going to follow one man on the longest commute in the history of literature. The distance from Troy to the island of Ithaca is only about 560 miles of sea. A decent sailing ship of the Bronze Age could cover that in 2 weeks, maybe 3 with bad luck. The man we are following tonight took 10 years. Along the way he was captured by a giant, turned down immortality, sailed to the land of the dead, and came home to find over 100 strangers eating his food and courting his wife. And then things got violent. Before we set sail, take a brief moment to like this video and subscribe. If you genuinely enjoy what we do here, it costs you nothing and it keeps these long, quiet stories coming. And do something else for me as well. Post your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other sleepless people around the world find their way here too, and there is something oddly comforting about knowing who else is lying awake with you tonight. Now settle in, let your shoulders drop, and get comfortable. You are about to drift into the story of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the man the ancient world called the most cunning of all the Greeks. Our story begins not with the hero, but with his absence. Picture a small rocky island off the western coast of Greece, sometime around the year 1200 BC. The island is called Ithaca. It is not a rich place. The ground is too stony for good farming, and the hills are better suited to goats than to grain. But it sits well for a seafaring people, and its harbours are deep and sheltered. On the highest ground stands a palace. Not a palace as we imagine palaces, not marble columns and golden gates, but a large sprawling house of stone and timber, with storerooms full of wine and oil, a great hall with a central hearth, and a courtyard where dogs doze in the sun. This palace belongs to a king named Odysseus, and Odysseus has not been seen for 20 years. He left when his son Telemachus was a newborn, sailing east with 12 ships and about 600 men to fight in a war at a city called Troy. That war, as everyone in the Greek world knows, lasted 10 years and ended in a Greek victory. The other kings came home. Nestor returned to sandy Pylos and grew old telling war stories. Menelaus made it back to Sparta with Helen, the wife whose face had started the whole business. Even Agamemnon, the High King, made it home, though what happened to him when he walked through his own front door is a grim story we will touch on later. But of Odysseus, nothing. No ship, no message, no body. For 10 years after the war ended, the sea simply refused to give him back or give him up. And here is where the trouble starts. Because in the Greek world of the Bronze Age, a kingdom without a king is a wound that does not close. There is no clear law of succession, no council of regents, no orderly system waiting to take over. There is only property and the strong men who want it. By the time our story opens, 108 of those strong men have moved into the palace of Odysseus. They are the young nobles of Ithaca and the surrounding islands, and they are called the suitors, because each of them wants to marry Penelope, the queen. Whoever marries her takes the palace, the wealth, and very likely the throne. So they wait. And while they wait, they eat. Day after day, the suitors slaughter the king's cattle and pigs, drain his wine cellars, and lounge in his great hall playing games and shouting for the servants. They have been doing this for years. It is a slow, legal, smiling form of robbery. No single feast breaks any rule of hospitality, but 1,000 feasts together are bleeding the estate white. The Greeks had a sacred custom called xenia, the law of guest friendship, which obliged a household to feed and shelter visitors. The suitors have taken this beautiful custom and turned it into a weapon. They are guests who will not leave. At the centre of this occupied house stand 2 people holding the line. The first is Penelope, the queen. She is one of the most quietly remarkable characters in all of ancient literature. She cannot fight the suitors, she cannot expel them. She has no army, no husband, and no certainty that her husband is even alive. What she has is patience and a very good mind. For 3 years she held the suitors off with a single trick. She announced that she would choose a new husband as soon as she finished weaving a burial shroud for her elderly father-in-law, Laertes. Every day she sat at her great loom, weaving, and every night, by torchlight, she carefully unpicked the day's work, thread by thread. The shroud never grew, the wedding never came closer. It took 3 years, and a disloyal servant girl before the suitors discovered why. The second is Telemachus, the son. He was a baby when his father sailed, and now he is a young man of about 20, which means he has never once seen his father's face. He has grown up in a house full of men who mock him, in the shadow of a legend he cannot remember. He is old enough to be angry and not yet strong enough to do anything about it. There are 108 of them and one of him. This is the situation on Ithaca as our story opens, and it is worth pausing to notice something. The poem that tells this story, the Odyssey, does not begin with its hero at all. It begins with the mess he left behind. The ancient Greek audience, hearing this poem sung aloud by a bard at a feast, would have understood immediately what was at stake. This is not just an adventure story about monsters and magic. It is a story about a household on the edge of destruction, and about whether order can ever be restored once it has broken. A word now about where this story comes from, because the telling of it is nearly as remarkable as the tale itself. The Odyssey is attributed to a poet named Homer, and it was composed somewhere around the 8th century BC, roughly 700 years before Julius Caesar and about 2700 years before us. But here is the strange part. The events it describes, the Trojan War and its aftermath, belong to an even older world, the Greek Bronze Age, some 400 to 500 years before Homer himself. That world had collapsed long before the poet was born. Its palaces had burned, its writing system had been forgotten, and its kings had passed into legend. Homer was singing about a lost civilization the way we might tell stories about knights and castles. And for centuries, the poem was not written down at all. It lived in the memories of professional singers who could recite tens of thousands of lines from memory, adjusting and polishing with each performance. The Odyssey is about 12,000 lines long. Sung aloud, it takes somewhere around 20 hours, which means the original audience experienced it more or less the way you are experiencing it tonight, in the dark, over many evenings, told by a single voice. Nobody knows who Homer really was, or whether he was one person or many, or whether he could see, since a persistent ancient tradition insisted he was blind. The Greeks themselves argued about it. 7 different cities claimed to be his birthplace, which tells you mostly that being Homer's hometown was excellent for tourism even 2,500 years ago. What matters for us tonight is the story itself, and the story now needs its missing man. Far away from Ithaca, at the very moment the suitors are carving another of his oxen, Odysseus is sitting on a beach at the edge of the world. The island is called Ogygia, and it belongs to a goddess named Calypso, who found him shipwrecked and half-drowned 7 years ago and has kept him ever since. She loves him, after her fashion. She has offered to make him immortal if he will stay and be her husband. He has refused. Every day he sits on the shore, looking east across the empty water, toward a home he has not seen in 20 years, and weeps. He does not know if his wife has remarried. He does not know his son's face. He does not know that his mother has died of grief, or that his old father has withdrawn to a farm in the hills and sleeps in the ashes like a servant. He knows only that everything he wants is on the other side of a sea that a very powerful god has closed against him. How he angered that god, how he lost all 12 ships and all 600 men, and how a war over one woman pulled him away from another. That story starts at the beginning, and the beginning is Troy, the war that started everything. To understand why Odysseus ever left his rocky island, we have to go back about a decade before the war, to a wedding problem in the city of Sparta. The king of Sparta at that time was a man named Tyndareus, and he had a daughter named Helen who was said to be the most beautiful woman in the world. This sounds like a blessing. It was closer to a security crisis. Every unmarried king and prince in Greece wanted to marry her, and dozens of them arrived in Sparta at once, armed, proud, and touchy about their honour. Whichever man Tyndareus chose, the others might feel insulted enough to start a war on the spot. The wedding of the century was one wrong word away from becoming a battlefield. Among the crowd of suitors was a young king from the Western Islands, not especially rich, not especially handsome, but already famous for his brains. This was Odysseus. And Odysseus, sizing up the situation, realized two things. First, he had no realistic chance of winning Helen against wealthier rivals. Second, there was an opportunity here anyway. He went quietly to Tyndareus and offered him a solution to the whole dangerous mess in exchange for a favour. The solution was this. Before any choice was announced, every single suitor would swear a solemn oath, binding before the gods, that he would accept whichever man was chosen and, more than that, would come to the defence of that marriage if anyone ever violated it. The suitors, each hoping he would be the winner, all swore. Then Tyndareus chose Menelaus, a prince of the powerful house of Atreus, and nobody could object, because everybody had promised. The favour Odysseus asked in return tells you what he actually valued. He wanted help winning the hand of a different woman, Tyndareus' niece, a clever and steady young woman named Penelope. He got her, and by all accounts it was that rarest thing in Greek mythology, a genuinely good marriage. Odysseus took his bride home to Ithaca, and in time they had a son. Now notice what Odysseus had done. He had diffused a crisis, made a powerful friend, and won the wife he wanted. But he had also, without knowing it, built the trap that would one day close on his own life. That oath he invented was a loaded weapon, lying on the table of Greek politics, waiting for someone to pick it up. The someone was a prince of Troy named Paris. Troy was a real place. Its ruins stand today on a low hill in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik, overlooking the strait that connects the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. In the late Bronze Age it was a wealthy fortified city, well positioned to profit from trade passing between two seas, with massive sloping stone walls that archaeologists have actually dug out of the earth. To the Greeks, it was a rich, sophisticated, slightly foreign kingdom on the edge of their world. According to the legend, the trouble began at a wedding on Mount Olympus, when the goddess of discord tossed a golden apple inscribed with the words, "For the fairest," into a party of goddesses. 3 of them claimed it: Hera, the queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite, goddess of love. Zeus, showing the good judgment that kept him in power, refused to pick a winner himself and handed the decision to a mortal, a handsome young Trojan prince named Paris who was minding cattle on a mountainside. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe. Hera offered him power over all of Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in every battle. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, being young, chose the woman. It is generally considered the worst decision in Greek mythology, made against remarkably strong competition. The most beautiful woman in the world, of course, was already married. That did not stop Aphrodite. When Paris came to Sparta on a diplomatic visit, Menelaus received him with full honours, feasted him, and then trustingly sailed off to a funeral in Crete, leaving his guest at home with his wife. When Menelaus returned, Helen was gone, sailed away to Troy with Paris, along with a good portion of the palace treasury. Whether she went willingly or was taken by force is a question the Greeks themselves argued about for 1,000 years, and the ancient sources give you both versions. Either way, the oath came due. Menelaus went to his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and the most powerful ruler in Greece, and Agamemnon sent out the call. Every man who had sworn the oath of Tyndareus was now bound to sail against Troy and bring Helen back. And here we meet one of the most human moments in the whole legend. Odysseus did not want to go. He was no coward, but he could count. Troy was far away, its walls were famous, and the war promised to be long. He had a young wife, an infant son, and a kingdom that needed him. An old prophecy was said to have warned him that if he went to Troy, he would not return for 20 years, and would come back alone and unrecognized. So when the recruiters arrived on Ithaca, led by a sharp-minded noble named Palamedes, Odysseus tried the only escape available to a man bound by a sacred oath. He pretended to be insane. The recruiters found the king of Ithaca ploughing a field, but ploughing it wrong in every way a field can be ploughed wrong. He had yoked an ox and a donkey together, two animals of different sizes and speeds, so the plough lurched and wandered. He was sowing the furrows with salt instead of seed. He stared through his visitors as if they were not there. A madman cannot swear oaths, and a madman cannot fight. It was a good performance. Palamedes did not believe a word of it, and he devised a test as ruthless as it was simple. He took the infant Telemachus from his nurse and placed the baby on the ground directly in the path of the oncoming plough. Odysseus swerved. Of course he swerved, and in that swerve the whole performance collapsed. A man sane enough to save his son was sane enough to go to war, so Odysseus went. He never forgave Palamedes, and years later, at Troy, he would take a cold and carefully constructed revenge on him, forging evidence that framed Palamedes as a traitor and getting him stoned to death by the army. It is one of the darkest stories attached to Odysseus, and the Odyssey itself politely never mentions it. But it is worth knowing, because it shows you the other edge of the blade. The cleverness that saves Odysseus again and again in the story we're about to follow could also destroy, and did. Once caught, Odysseus threw himself into the war effort with the energy of a man who knows the fastest way home is through. He became the expedition's chief recruiter and fixer. His most famous catch was a teenager hidden on the island of Skyros, disguised in girl's clothing among the daughters of the local king, because his goddess mother knew he was fated to die at Troy. The boy's name was Achilles, and he was prophesied to be the greatest warrior of his generation. Odysseus found him with a trick, naturally. He arrived disguised as a peddler and laid out his wares before the king's daughters, fine cloth and jewellery, with a spear and shield mixed in among them. Then he arranged for a war trumpet to sound an alarm. The girls scattered. One of them grabbed the spear and shield and stood ready to fight. Odysseus had his man. By the time the fleet gathered at the port of Aulis, it was the largest armed force the Greek world had ever assembled. More than 1,000 ships, according to the poets, drawn from every kingdom of Greece. Odysseus commanded his 12 ships from Ithaca and the Western Islands, a modest squadron beside the 100 ships of Agamemnon. But the High King had not brought him along for his numbers. The wind failed at Aulis, and the fleet sat trapped in harbour until Agamemnon, told by a priest that he had offended the goddess Artemis, paid the price she demanded, the sacrifice of his own daughter Iphigenia, lured to the camp with the promise of a wedding. The wind rose, the fleet sailed, and behind it, in Mycenae, a queen named Clytemnestra began the long, patient hatred of her husband that would one day finish what Troy could not. The 1,000 ships crossed the Aegean toward a war everyone expected to be short. It would consume 10 years, and the best men of a generation. And in the middle of it all, holding the fraying enterprise together with words, tricks, and sheer stubbornness, would be the man who had tried to plough his way out of coming. 10 years before the walls. The Greeks beached their ships on the shore below Troy, built a fortified camp, and settled in for what they still believed would be a quick campaign. It lasted 10 years, and to understand why, you only need to look at the walls. The walls of Troy were the finest fortifications in that corner of the world, high-sloping courses of cut stone crowned with brick, anchored by towers, and so famous that legend claimed gods had helped build them. The Greeks of the Bronze Age had no siege towers, no catapults, no engineering tradition for cracking a fortress of that scale. What they had was infantry, chariots, and time. So the war became something slower and stranger than a siege as we imagine one. The Greeks could not seal the city off completely, and the Trojans, backed by allies from all over Anatolia, could not push the invaders back into the sea. For years the fighting rolled back and forth across the plain between the walls and the ships, while Greek squadrons raided the surrounding towns for food, treasure, and captives. In that long grind, different men mattered in different ways. Achilles was the spearhead, the terror of the battlefield, worth a regiment by himself. Great Ajax was the wall, the huge man with the huge shield who never broke. Agamemnon held the command, and Nestor, the old king of Pylos, supplied seasoned advice. Odysseus became something else, something no other leader could be. He was the mind of the army. When the Greeks needed a negotiator, they sent Odysseus. Before the fighting even began, he and Menelaus walked into Troy itself under diplomatic protection and stood before the Trojan assembly to demand Helen's return. The Trojans who heard him speak remembered it years later. He did not look like much at first, they said. He stood stiffly, eyes down, holding the speaker's staff as if he had never used one, and you might have taken him for a sulky, awkward man. Then he began to speak, and the words came like snowflakes in a winter storm, and no man alive could match him. Troy refused the demand anyway. There were Trojans who wanted to hand Helen back and end the danger, but the court around old King Priam chose war. When the army's morale cracked, it was Odysseus who repaired it. In the 9th year, Agamemnon made the mistake of testing his exhausted troops by suggesting they give up and sail home, expecting them to refuse. Instead, they cheered and bolted for the ships. The whole 10-year enterprise was minutes from dissolving. It was Odysseus who ran through the mob, snatching the royal staff, shaming the officers, striking the loudest agitator, and driving the army back to its assembly. He talked them back into their own war. No sword accomplished more that day. When quarrels broke out at the top, it was Odysseus they sent to fix them. The most dangerous quarrel of all came late in the war, when Agamemnon insulted Achilles over a captive woman named Briseis, and Achilles, the indispensable man, withdrew himself and his troops from the fighting and sat in his tent while Trojan attacks reached the Greek ships and set them burning. Agamemnon, humbled, offered a fortune in gifts to bring him back, and chose Odysseus to lead the embassy and make the case. Odysseus laid out the offer with every persuasive skill he had. Achilles refused him. It is one of the few recorded defeats of Odysseus in the art of talking, and it took the death of Achilles' dearest friend Patroclus to do what words could not. And when the work was dirty, Odysseus did that too. One black night, he and the warrior Diomedes slipped out of the camp to scout the enemy lines. They caught a Trojan spy named Dolon creeping the other way, promised him his life for information, emptied him of everything he knew, and then killed him anyway. Then they used what they had learned to raid the camp of a newly arrived Trojan ally, the Thracian king Rhesus, slaughtering him and 12 of his men in their sleep and driving off his magnificent horses. On another occasion, Odysseus disguised himself as a beggar, whipped and bloodied, and infiltrated Troy itself to gather intelligence. Inside the city, Helen recognized him, and, weary of Troy, kept his secret. Later still, he and Diomedes stole into the city a final time, and carried off the Palladium, the sacred image of Athena on which, prophecy said, the safety of Troy depended. You may notice that these exploits are not exactly glorious in the way Achilles was glorious. Night raids, disguises, interrogations, theft. Homeric warfare had a code, and Odysseus operated at its edges. The Greeks themselves felt this tension. Later centuries would argue about him endlessly, some celebrating the resourceful hero, others condemning the liar and schemer. He is the rare legendary figure who is both the most admired and the most distrusted man in his own story. The war ground on, and it consumed the great names one by one. Hector, the noble defender of Troy, fell to Achilles in single combat beneath the walls, and Achilles, mad with grief for Patroclus, dragged the body behind his chariot in the dust. Old King Priam crossed the plain alone at night to kneel before his son's killer and beg for the corpse, and Achilles, moved at last, gave it back. That truce for a funeral is where the Iliad, the other great Homeric poem, ends. But the war did not. Achilles himself died soon after, as prophecy had always said he would, shot down by an arrow from Paris, guided, the poets said, by the god Apollo, striking the one vulnerable spot on his body, the heel that has carried his name into every language since. the greatest warrior of the age, burned on a pyre by the shore of a foreign sea. His death set off one last poisonous quarrel. The magnificent armour of Achilles, forged by the smith god Hephaestus himself, had to go to someone, and the two claimants were the two most deserving men in the army. Great Ajax, the strongest of the Greeks after Achilles, who had carried the hero's body out of the battle, and Odysseus, who had held off the Trojans while he did it. The army judged the contest, some say with Trojan prisoners as jurors, and the armour went to Odysseus. The mind in the end was valued over the muscle. Ajax could not bear it. That night his sanity gave way. Athena clouded his mind, and he fell upon the army's herds of sheep and cattle in the dark, slaughtering them by the hundred, convinced he was butchering Odysseus and Agamemnon and the commanders who had wronged him. When dawn came and he saw what he had actually done, standing among the carcasses, the shame was more than a hero of his kind could survive. He planted his sword in the earth, point up, and fell on it. The Greeks had lost their second greatest warrior not to Troy, but to their own prize-giving. Odysseus, to his credit, argued afterward that Ajax deserved an honourable burial over Agamemnon's objections. He had wanted the armour, not the ruin. So the 10th year found the Greek army victorious in almost every way that did not matter. Their best fighters were dead or spent. Troy's champion Hector was gone. Paris himself was eventually killed, and the city was battered, hungry, and stripped of allies. But the walls still stood, and the gates still held, and no Greek force had ever set foot inside them. Prophecies were collected and ticked off like items on a list. Fetch the bow of Heracles. Bring the son of Achilles into the war. Steal the Palladium. Odysseus arranged them all. Still the city stood. 10 years of blood had proven one thing beyond argument. Troy could not be taken by force. If it fell, it would fall to something else. And on the shore by the ships, the man who had spent a decade as the army's brain began to turn over an idea. It involved carpentry, an empty beach, and the most famous piece of livestock in human history, the wooden horse. The idea, when Odysseus finally laid it out for the other commanders, must have sounded like a joke. The mightiest army of the age had failed to break Troy in 10 years of open war. The new plan was to stop trying. Instead, the Greeks would pretend to give up, and they would leave a present. Here is how it worked. Under the direction of a craftsman named Epeius, and with the guidance of Athena, the Greeks built an enormous hollow horse of wooden planks, tall as a siege tower, polished and finished like an offering to the gods. Inside its belly was a hidden compartment, with room for a picked force of armed men. The number varies by the telling, from a couple of dozen to more than 50, but every version agrees on who commanded them. Odysseus sat inside his own idea, in the dark, with the best remaining warriors of Greece packed around him. Then the army did the hard part. It vanished. The Greeks burned their camp, dragged their ships into the sea, and sailed away in full view of the walls, leaving the great horse standing alone on the empty shore. The fleet did not go home. It went just over the horizon, to the island of Tenedos, and waited. One man stayed behind on purpose. His name was Sinon, a volunteer for what may be the bravest and least celebrated job in the whole war. His task was to be captured. Found hiding in the marshes, dragged before the Trojans, Sinon spun the story of his life. He claimed the Greeks had given up and sailed for home, and that they had left the horse as an offering to Athena to atone for the theft of the Palladium. He claimed they had built it deliberately huge so the Trojans could never bring it inside their walls, because a prophecy said that if the horse ever stood in Troy, the city would be untouchable forever. And he claimed the Greeks had meant to sacrifice him, Sinon, to the gods for a safe voyage, and that he had escaped and now hated his own countrymen. Every detail was engineered, almost certainly by Odysseus, to make the Trojans want the horse, not merely tolerate it. The lie did not push, it pulled. Not everyone was fooled. A Trojan priest named Laocoon warned against the gift with a line that became immortal, saying he feared Greeks even when they brought presents, and he hurled a spear into the horse's flank. where it stood quivering in the wood. Inside, the hidden men held their breath, and then, in front of the whole city, 2 enormous serpents came out of the sea and crushed Laocoon and his sons to death. The Trojans read it as divine judgment on a man who had insulted a sacred offering. The Princess Cassandra, cursed by Apollo to prophesy the truth and never be believed, cried out that the horse was full of armed men. The city laughed at her, as it always did. The Trojans breached their own wall to bring their prize inside, hauled the horse up to the citadel with ropes and rollers, wreathed it in flowers, and threw the biggest party in the city's history. 10 years of siege were over. They drank the way people drink when a war ends, and by the small hours, Troy was asleep for the first time in a decade with no watch worth the name. In the darkness inside the horse, there had been one last test of nerve. Helen herself had come down to the horse in the evening, and, whether from suspicion or mischief or some divided loyalty of her own, had circled it, calling out to the hidden men, imitating the voices of their wives. One of the warriors, hearing his wife's voice after 10 years, nearly answered. Odysseus clamped a hand over his mouth and held it there until Helen gave up and walked away. In some tellings he held the man down until he had strangled the life out of him, rather than let him make a sound. That is likely a later embroidery, but it captures a truth about that night. Everything, the war, the fleet, every life in the horse, hung on silence. Deep in the night, Sinon slipped out and lit a signal fire. On Tenedos, the fleet saw it and turned back for the shore, and inside the citadel, a hatch opened in the belly of the horse, and Odysseus and his men came down a rope ladder into the sleeping heart of Troy. They killed the few sentries, opened the gates, and let the returning army pour in. What followed was not a battle, it was the sack of a city, and the ancient tellings do not soften it. The Trojans woke to fire and screaming and armed men already in their streets. Some fought back magnificently and hopelessly, half-armed, in doorways and courtyards. Priam's palace became a slaughterhouse. The old king himself put on armour his body could no longer carry, and his wife Hecuba pulled him back to shelter at the household altar, the most sacred place of refuge in his world. It did not save him. Neoptolemus, the teenage son of dead Achilles, killed Priam at the altar itself, one of the great sacrileges of that terrible night. There were others, and the poets recorded them like charges in an indictment. Cassandra fled to the temple of Athena and clung to the statue of the goddess, and a Greek commander called Ajax the Lesser, a different man from the great Ajax, tore her away from it and violated her in the sanctuary. Hector's small son Astyanax was thrown from the walls, killed as a child so he could never grow into an avenger. The women of the royal house, queens and princesses of the richest city in that world, were divided among the victors as property. Andromache, Hector's widow, went to the son of the man who had killed her husband. Hecuba, the old queen, went to Odysseus. By morning, Troy was a smoking ruin, and everything the Greeks had come for was in their ships. Helen was returned to Menelaus, who had sworn to kill her on sight, and found, standing in front of her, that he could not. Now, here is the turn in the story that ancient audiences understood in their bones, and that we need to understand to make sense of everything that follows. The Greeks had won the war, and in the winning of it, they had lost the gods. Greek religion was not a religion of mercy, but it was a religion of limits. Altars were sacred, temples were sacred. Suppliants, people who placed themselves under a god's protection, were untouchable. On the night Troy fell, the victors broke every one of those limits, drunk on 10 years of pent-up rage. Athena, who had backed the Greeks through the entire war, who had helped design the horse itself, turned on them overnight because of the outrage against Cassandra in her own temple. When the army failed to punish Ajax the Lesser for it, her anger settled on the whole fleet. The homecomings, as a result, became a second catastrophe. The Greeks quarrelled before they even sailed, splitting the fleet. Storms scattered them across the eastern Mediterranean. Ajax the Lesser was shipwrecked, dragged himself onto a rock, boasted that he had survived in spite of the gods, and was promptly smashed into the sea by Poseidon for the remark. Menelaus was blown to Egypt and wandered for 7 years. Agamemnon reached home swiftly, which turned out to be the worst luck of all. His wife Clytemnestra, who had spent 10 years remembering the daughter he sacrificed at Aulis, welcomed him with a red carpet, a bath, and a knife. The High King of the Greeks, conqueror of Troy, was butchered in his own house on the day of his return. And Odysseus, who had built the horse and won the war, put to sea from the ruins of Troy with his 12 ships and roughly 600 men, expecting, like everyone else, to be home in a few weeks. The gods had other plans, and so, in fairness, did Odysseus' own choices. The city he had burned would be avenged not by armies but by geography, weather, appetite, and one very large angry shepherd. The journey was about to begin. The fleet set sail. 12 ships stood off the Trojan shore in the early summer light, loaded low in the water with plunder. Each was a black-hulled galley of the Bronze Age type, perhaps 50 men to a ship, a single mast with one square sail, and benches of rowers for when the wind failed. No decks to sleep under, no cabins, no compass, no charts. Sailors of that age navigated by coastlines, landmarks, stars, and accumulated memory, and they beached their ships at night whenever they could, because the open sea after dark was no place for sensible men. The route home was simple, and every man aboard knew it. Southwest along the coast of Asia Minor, island hopping across the Aegean, around the southern capes of Greece, then north up the western coast to Ithaca, 560 miles or so, a few weeks of sailing. Some of the men had been teenagers when they left home. They were now in their 30s, and their sons, like Telemachus, were nearly grown. Every hour of sailing was an hour closer to faces they had spent 10 years trying to remember. And then, at the very first opportunity, they threw it away. The coast of Thrace lay near their route, and on it stood the city of Ismarus, home of a people called the Cicones, who had been allies of Troy. To a Bronze Age war fleet, an enemy city with its army gone was not a place to avoid. It was a target. Raiding was not considered piracy in that world, or rather, piracy was not considered shameful. It was what armed men in ships did, an accepted way for kings to grow rich, and after 10 years of war it was practically a reflex. Odysseus gave the order, and the fleet fell on Ismarus. The raid succeeded the way these things succeeded. The town was sacked, its men killed, its women and treasure divided among the crews. Odysseus, telling the story later, is completely matter-of-fact about it. This is worth pausing on, because it is our first clear look at the hero outside the war, and he does not look much like a hero. He looks like what he is, a Bronze Age warlord doing ordinary Bronze Age warlord things. The Odyssey does not apologise for this. It simply shows it, and then it shows the bill. Odysseus, reading the situation, ordered an immediate withdrawal to the ships. The crews refused. There was wine on the beach, and slaughtered sheep and cattle, and after a decade of army rations they were going to have their feast. They ate and drank through the afternoon and into the night, while survivors of Ismarus slipped away inland to their kinsmen, the Cicones of the interior, who were numerous, warlike, and rather good with chariots. At dawn the counterattack came, and it came in strength that Homer compares to leaves in springtime. The Greeks, heavy with wine and mutton, had to form up on an open beach against fresh troops. They held through the morning. By afternoon the line broke, and the crews scrambled for the ships under attack, hauling off from the shore with spears falling around them. When they were clear and counted heads, the arithmetic was brutal. 6 men lost from each ship, 72 dead, give or take, traded for a pile of loot and a party. The fleet rowed away in silence, and Odysseus records that they called the names of their dead 3 times across the water before setting course, so the ghosts would not be left behind unmourned. It is an ugly little episode, and it is placed at the front of the voyage on purpose. Before any monsters appear, before any god intervenes, the pattern of the whole journey is set in miniature at Ismarus. Odysseus gives sound orders. The crew disobeys them for the sake of appetite. Men die. Remember that pattern. It will repeat, at larger and larger scale, until there is no crew left. The fleet ran southwest with a following wind, licking its wounds, and made for the southern tip of Greece. They passed the island of Cythera and came to the last great obstacle on the route, Cape Malea, the southeastern fingertip of the Greek mainland. And here we must speak of geography for a moment, because Cape Malea is not a legend. It is a real headland, and it has been feared by real sailors for as long as ships have existed. The mountains of the cape funnel and twist the winds, the currents are treacherous, and weather from the north can hurl a vessel away from land faster than oars can answer. Ancient Greeks had a proverb about it. Round Malea and forget your home. In the days of sail, ships wrecked there by the hundred, and modern archaeologists have found the sea floor around it littered with cargoes spanning thousands of years. Odysseus's fleet reached Malea, turned the corner, and was nearly home. Ithaca lay perhaps a week away. Then the north wind came down like a fist. The storm caught the 12 ships at the worst possible place and drove them bodily away from the cape, south past Cythera, out into open water. For 2 days and nights they ran before it, sails torn, unable to claw back. On the 3rd day the sky cleared, and they raised sail and tried to beat back north. The wind and current would not let them. 9 days, Odysseus says. The winds carried them across the fish-filled sea, away from every coastline any man aboard had ever seen or heard described. 9 days is the poem's way of drawing a line on the map and then erasing the map. Somewhere in those 9 days, the fleet crossed out of the known world. Everything before Malea is real geography you can visit today. Troy, Ismarus, Cythera, the Cape itself. Everything after it belongs to a different kind of space, a sea of islands that appear on no chart, populated by beings that follow no human rules. Ancient readers already argued about where the Lotus Eaters or the Cyclops were supposed to live, pinning them hopefully to Libya or Sicily, and the geographer, Eratosthenes, a very sensible man, said you would find the route of Odysseus when you found the cobbler who sewed the bag of the winds. He meant that you would not. For the men on the ships, of course, it was not a literary transition. It was slow, dawning dread. Bronze Age sailors lived by known coasts the way we live by roads, and they were now beyond all of them, running on guesswork, with the water skins going flat and no idea what shore would rise ahead. 10 years of war had at least been 10 years in a known place. This was something new, the particular fear of being lost, which is different from the fear of being attacked, and in some ways worse, because there is nothing to fight. On the 10th day, a low green coastline lifted over the horizon. The ships ran in, found fresh water, and the exhausted crews ate a meal on the beach of whatever they had left. It seemed a gentle place. No walls, no chariots, no spear points glinting on the hills. Odysseus, cautious now after Ismarus, did not land the whole force. He picked 2 sailors and a herald, 3 men, and sent them inland with the simplest instructions in the world. Find out who lives here and whether they eat bread, which was the Greek way of asking whether the inhabitants were civilized human beings. The 3 men walked into the green interior of the country, and they did not come back. The land of the Lotus Eaters. The people of that coast were called the Lotus Eaters, and they were, by every outward measure, the kindest hosts Odysseus would meet on his entire voyage. They did not attack the 3 scouts. They did not rob them, enslave them, or hold them for ransom. They welcomed the strangers, sat them down, and shared their food, which is exactly what the sacred law of hospitality asked of them. The food was the fruit of the lotus, a sweet flowering plant that was the whole of their diet and, as far as anyone could tell, the whole of their civilization. And whoever ate it stopped wanting to go home. That is the entire mechanism of the episode, and its quiet horror. The lotus did not poison the body or enslave the will. The scouts were awake, healthy, comfortable, and perfectly content. They simply no longer cared about Ithaca. The wives and children they had spent 10 years fighting to return to faded into a pleasant irrelevance, like a story about someone else. All they wanted was to stay where they were, among the Lotus Eaters, eating lotus forever. When you consider what these particular men had endured to get even this far, war, storm, the beach at Ismarus, there is something almost merciful in it. The lotus offered them the one thing no god had offered, an end to wanting. Odysseus understood the danger at once, and his response tells you a great deal about him. He did not negotiate, and he did not send more men, and he certainly did not sample the fruit himself to assess the threat. He went in personally with a rescue party, seized the 3 weeping scouts by force, dragged them back to the ships as they begged to stay, and tied them to the rowing benches. Then he ordered every other man aboard immediately, before anyone else could taste the fruit. And the fleet pulled away from that gentle coast at speed, with 3 of its sailors lashed down and sobbing for the shore. It is a small episode, barely 20 lines in Homer, with no battle and no body count, and yet the poet placed it first among all the strange encounters of the voyage, ahead of giants and witches and monsters, and thinkers have been unpacking it ever since. Because the Lotus Eaters establish what the entire Odyssey is actually about, and it is not seafaring, it is memory, and the terrible effort of continuing to want something difficult when something easy is within reach. Consider the shape of the threat. Every other danger on this voyage will attack the body. The Lotus attacked the homecoming itself, the desire for it, the engine that made the whole journey mean anything. A man killed by a monster dies on the way home. A man who eats the lotus is worse than dead, in the poem's terms, because the way home no longer exists inside him. Nothing has been taken from him, except the wanting, and without the wanting, he is no longer going anywhere. He is just alive, indefinitely, pleasantly, in a place that is not his. The Greeks had a word that sits at the centre of this poem, nostos, meaning homecoming, the return of the hero across the sea. Pair it with another Greek word, algos, meaning pain, and you get a word that was actually coined thousands of years later by a Swiss medical student to describe homesick soldiers, nostalgia, the ache for return. The Odyssey is the founding document of that ache, and the Lotus Eaters are its founding warning that the ache can be cured, and that the cure is a kind of death. Odysseus drags his men back to their benches, not because the lotus will hurt them, but because it will make them stop hurting, and the hurt is the only compass they have. It is also worth noticing who succumbed and who did not. The scouts ate. Odysseus did not. Through the whole voyage this will hold. The crew reaches for whatever is in front of them: food, wine, plunder, sleep, safety. And Odysseus, whatever his other failings, keeps choosing the difficult thing that is further away. Not because he is immune to temptation. Later episodes will show him very tempted indeed, by comfort, by glory, even by immortality. But he can hold a future in his mind vividly enough to outweigh a present pleasure, and most of his men, brave as they are, cannot. In the arithmetic of this poem, that single capacity, more than strength or courage, is what separates the one man who gets home from the 600 who do not. People have long wondered whether a real plant hides behind the story. Ancient writers themselves went looking, and Herodotus, the great traveller and historian, reported a people on the coast of North Africa who lived on the sweet fruit of a real shrub and were called by the Greeks lotus eaters. That plant still grows there, a modest relative of the jujube, pleasant and entirely harmless, which rather undersells the legend. Others have proposed the blue water lily of the Nile, which has mild sedative properties, or the opium poppy, known and cultivated in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, whose effects on motivation need no elaboration. The honest answer is that Homer was not writing botany. Whatever seed of travellers' gossip started the tale, the poet turned it into something no plant can be, a pure image of forgetting, and it is as recognisable now as it was 2,700 years ago. Every age since has had no trouble naming its own lotus. The fleet stood out to sea and left the lotus eaters exactly as it found them, mild, generous, and going nowhere. The only people in the whole epic who never harmed anyone and never will. Behind the ships, their green country sank into the haze. On the benches, the 3 rescued men wept themselves quiet, and then, as the fruit's hold faded with distance, slowly came back to themselves and their oars, remembering, perhaps with mixed feelings, that they had wives and debts and a very long way to go. Ahead lay open water, and in time, another landfall, a rugged coastline of mountains and forest under a smoke-grey sky. This next country did not look gentle, and it was not. Its inhabitants planted nothing, ploughed nothing, built no ships, held no assemblies, and made no laws, each family answerable to itself in its own cave in the hills. The Greeks could see, even from the water, the mouths of those caves, and the huge folds and pens for flocks, and here and there on the slopes, figures moving that seemed, at that distance, surely a trick of the light, because they were far too large to be men. Odysseus looked at that shore, and his curiosity, the trait that made him great and would soon cost him more than any storm, began to stir. There was a smaller island offshore, wooded and full of wild goats, safe and empty. The sensible thing was to water the ships there, eat some goat, and leave. The fleet did anchor there, and did feast on the goats. And then, in the morning, Odysseus announced that he would take his own ship, only his own, across to the mainland, to find out what manner of beings lived in those caves, and whether they feared the gods, and whether they gave gifts to guests. He would get answers to all three questions. They were the worst answers available. The cave of the Cyclops. Odysseus crossed to the mainland with one ship and picked 12 of his best men for the shore party, leaving the rest to guard the vessel. He also brought something that seems, at first, like an odd item to pack for a reconnaissance. A goatskin of extraordinarily strong wine, a gift from a priest of Apollo whose family he had spared at Ismarus. It was dark, sweet, and so potent that its owner had mixed it 1 part wine to 20 parts water. Odysseus took it along, he says, because something in his spirit told him he was going to meet a savage stranger, huge and lawless. File that away. The wine is the whole story. They found the cave easily, a great cavern in the cliffs near the sea, fenced with a yard of quarried boulders and tall pines. Its owner was out pasturing his flocks, and inside, the Greeks found the home of a very orderly monster. Pens of lambs and kids sorted carefully by age, racks of cheeses, pails and bowls of milk and whey, everything clean and well managed. The crew, sensibly, wanted to steal some cheese and lambs, run to the ship, and sail away. Odysseus refused. He wanted to see the owner, he admits later, and to find out whether he would give guest gifts. 10 years of war had taught him everything except when to stop being curious. So they lit a fire, helped themselves to the cheese, and waited for the host to come home. The host came home at evening, driving his flocks before him and carrying an enormous load of firewood, which he flung down with a crash that sent the Greeks scrambling to the back of the cave. Then he rolled a boulder across the entrance, a stone so vast, Homer says, that 22 wagons could not have moved it, and the Greeks, hidden in the shadows, got their first clear look at him. His name was Polyphemus, and he was a Cyclops, one of a race of one-eyed giants, and, as it happened, a son of Poseidon, god of the sea. He milked his ewes and goats in perfect order, curdled half the milk for cheese, set the rest aside for his supper, and then rekindled the fire, and by its light he saw the men. The exchange that followed is one of the most chilling scenes in ancient literature, precisely because it starts as etiquette. Odysseus stepped forward and made a proper speech. They were Greeks, he said, homeward bound from Troy, driven off course, and they came to his knees as suppliants, hoping for hospitality or a guest gift, as is the custom. And he reminded the giant that Zeus himself protects strangers and avenges wrongs done to guests. It was the correct speech, the one that had worked on every civilized shore in the Greek world. Polyphemus answered that the Cyclopes cared nothing for Zeus or any god, being stronger than gods, and then asked, casually, where the ship was moored. Odysseus, lying smoothly even now, said the ship had been wrecked on the rocks and these men were the only survivors. Polyphemus made no reply to that at all. Instead he lunged, snatched up 2 of the sailors, 1 in each hand, dashed their brains out against the floor, tore them limb from limb, and ate them, bones and all, while their comrades wept and raised their hands to a Zeus who did not intervene. Then he washed down his meal with milk, stretched out among his sheep, and went to sleep. Consider Odysseus's position in that moment, because it is a perfect trap. His sword was at his side, and he was seriously tempted to creep over and drive it into the giant's liver. He stopped himself with a piece of cold reasoning. The boulder. If Polyphemus died, the door of the cave would stay shut forever, because all the men together could not shift that stone. Killing the monster meant starving to death beside his corpse. The prison and the jailer had to be kept alive. Whatever escape existed would have to leave the giant able to open the door, and unwilling or unable to stop them going through it. It is, if you step back, a genuinely elegant logic problem, being solved in the dark by a man listening to his friends being digested. Morning came, and Polyphemus breakfasted on 2 more sailors, then drove his flocks out to pasture, rolling the boulder back into place behind him as easily as a man caps a quiver. And through that long day, locked in the cave, Odysseus built his plan. There was a great club of green olive wood lying in the cave, big as a ship's mast. He cut a fathom's length from it, and his men shaved it smooth and sharpened one end to a point, and hardened the point in the fire, and hid the stake under the dung heaps. Then they drew lots for the 4 men who would help him drive it, and the lots, Odysseus notes, fell on exactly the men he would have chosen. Evening came, and the giant returned, and ate 2 more men. 6 gone now of 12. And now the wine. Odysseus filled a bowl with the priest's undiluted vintage, and offered it to Polyphemus, politely, as a gift. The drink meant to accompany the meal of human flesh. The giant drained it and demanded more, and more again, and then, mellowing horribly, offered his guest a gift in return, and asked his name. The answer Odysseus gave is the most famous lie in Western literature. "My name," he said, "is Nobody. That is what my mother and father and all my friends call me, Nobody." And Polyphemus, drunk and delighted with his own wit, announced his guest gift. He would eat nobody last, after all his companions. Then he toppled backward and passed out, so deep in wine that he vomited in his sleep. The Greeks pulled the stake from its hiding place and heated the point in the embers until the green wood was glowing and ready to catch. Odysseus says, a god breathed courage into them then, and they needed it. 4 men lifted the beam, Odysseus guided the point, and they drove it into the giant's single closed eye and leaned on it, and Odysseus spun it from above the way a shipwright spins a drill, and the eye hissed around the burning point, the way hot metal hisses when a smith plunges it into cold water. Polyphemus woke screaming, tore the stake out, and bellowed for help, and his fellow Cyclopes came running through the night from their caves in the hills and gathered outside the sealed boulder, asking what was wrong. Was someone stealing his flocks? Was someone killing him by treachery or violence? And from inside the cave came the anguished answer, nobody is killing me. Nobody, by treachery. His neighbours considered this. If nobody was harming him, they reasoned, then his trouble came from Zeus and was his own affair, and he should pray to his father Poseidon about it. And they went back to bed. The trap of the name had sprung perfectly. The victim's own cry for help had dismissed his rescuers, but the blinded giant still held the door. He rolled the boulder aside and sat in the entrance with his arms spread, feeling for anyone who tried to slip out among the sheep. He may have been a monster, but he was not entirely a fool, so Odysseus produced his second device. Working quietly in the depths of the cave, he lashed the giant's fat woolly rams together in threes with willow branches from the monster's own bed. Under the belly of each middle ram, he tied one of his men, with the flanking rams shielding him on either side. For himself he took the biggest ram of the flock and clung underneath it by hand, buried in the fleece. At dawn the rams pushed out to pasture as they always did, and Polyphemus stroked the back of every animal as it passed, and felt nothing but wool. His favourite, the great ram carrying Odysseus, came last, and the giant paused and spoke to it, gently, wondering aloud why the leader of the flock was slow today, and whether it grieved for its master's eye, and promising what he would do to nobody if he ever caught him. Then he let it through. Sometimes the most unsettling moment in a horror story is the tender one. Beyond the boulder, out of arm's reach, the Greeks untied themselves, ran for the ship driving the fat rams before them, and pulled hard for open water. 6 men fewer than they had come, but alive, free, and clear. And that should have been the end of it. It very nearly was. Nobody's fatal boast. The ship pulled away from the shore of the Cyclops, oars beating fast, the stolen rams bleating in the hold. Behind it, on the cliff top, the blinded giant felt his way along the rocks, following the sound of the rowing. The sensible course was silence. Every stroke brought distance, and distance was safety, and the men at the oars knew it. Odysseus could not help himself. When the ship was about as far offshore as a shout can carry, he stood up and delivered one. "Cyclops," he called, "if anyone asks how you lost your eye, tell them it was your own fault for devouring guests in your house, and that Zeus and the gods have punished you." The response was immediate and nearly fatal. Polyphemus wrenched the top off a hill and hurled it at the sound of the voice. The rock came down just ahead of the bow, and the wave it threw up drove the ship backward toward the beach, so close that the crew had to pole off the land and row for their lives. The men begged Odysseus, in so many words, to stop talking to the giant. Why provoke a creature that throws geography? He did not stop. This is the moment the whole voyage turns on, so let us slow down and watch it happen. The ship clawed out to twice the distance, and Odysseus rose again, and this time his shipmates physically tried to hold him back and talk him down. It was no use. Something in him, and Homer lets us see exactly what, needed the monster to know. "Cyclops," he shouted across the water, "if anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was nobody. Tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home is on Ithaca, name, title, father, and home address." He gave the monster everything. To understand why a clever man would do something so catastrophically stupid, you have to understand what a name meant in his world. The trick with nobody had saved 12 lives, but it carried a hidden price. As long as the giant thought nobody had beaten him, then in the accounting of fame that Greek heroes lived by, nobody had. The deed existed, but the credit did not. Heroes of that age lived and died for Kleos, the glory of having your name attached to your deeds and carried down the generations in song. An anonymous triumph was, in that currency, worthless. Standing in that boat, Odysseus was choosing between safety and signature, and he chose signature. It is the same appetite that took him into the cave in the first place, and it is about to be priced accurately. Because here is what he did not know. Polyphemus was not merely a large shepherd. He was a son of Poseidon, god of the sea, shaker of the earth, the second most powerful being in the Greek cosmos. And a curse, in Greek belief, was not a vague expression of ill will. It was a formal legal instrument, a petition addressed to a god. To file one effectively, you needed the offender's true name. Odysseus had just shouted his across the water, with his father's name and home port attached, like a man handing his full identification to the plaintiff in a lawsuit. Polyphemus lifted his hands to the starry sky and prayed, "Hear me, Poseidon, dark-haired encircler of the earth. If I am truly your son, grant that Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home is on Ithaca, may never reach that home. But if it is fated that he must, then let him come late and broken, after losing every one of his companions, on a stranger's ship, and let him find trouble in his house. Read that curse again, because it is the plot of the rest of this story, laid out in advance, item by item, late, broken, every companion lost, a stranger's ship, trouble in the house. Poseidon heard his son, and granted all of it. Then Polyphemus threw a second mountain, which missed astern and washed the ship helpfully out to sea, and the giant passes out of the story, though not out of its consequences. There is one more detail from the cave worth carrying with us, because Homer plants it quietly and lets it bloom later. Among the plunder, Odysseus had kept the great ram that carried him out, and back on the Goat Island, reunited with the rest of the fleet, he sacrificed it to Zeus, burning the thigh bones to the king of the gods and asking for a safe homecoming. Zeus, the poet tells us flatly, ignored the sacrifice. The god of guests had watched 6 of his suppliants eaten alive in that cave, but he had also watched the whole affair begin with uninvited men helping themselves to a stranger's cheese. And, more to the point, Zeus was already planning the destruction of the ships. The gods of this poem keep accounts, and their accounting rarely matches ours. From this point forward, the voyage of Odysseus has an adversary with a specific grievance, and it changes the nature of everything that follows. Storms are no longer weather, currents are no longer chance. The sea itself, the road home, the medium every mile of the journey must cross, belongs to the enemy. Poseidon cannot kill Odysseus, because fate, which binds even gods, has decreed a homecoming. But everything short of that is permitted, and Poseidon has a very long list of things short of that. Modern readers sometimes ask whether the punishment fits the crime. Polyphemus, after all, ate 6 men. Blinding him was self-defence of the plainest kind, and even the taunting, while reckless, hardly seems to merit 10 years of persecution and 600 deaths. The ancient answer is uncomfortable but consistent. The gods do not punish in proportion, they punish in response, according to their own honour and their own attachments. Poseidon is not weighing evidence. He is a father whose son was mutilated, and he has the power to make his anger into weather. Part of what the Odyssey teaches, patiently, across its whole length, is the shape of a universe run by beings, with human passions and inhuman power, and how a mortal survives in it. The answer is not innocence. Odysseus is not innocent. The answer is endurance. There is also, hidden in the affair, a lesson Odysseus himself will demonstrate that he learned, though it costs him years. The next time we hear him refuse to give his name, and there will be a next time, in a king's hall, with everything at stake, he will hold it back through feast after feast, tears and all, until the moment of maximum advantage. And on the day he finally walks into his own house, he will do it as nobody, an anonymous beggar in his own hall, and he will keep that disguise clamped down through insult after insult, for days, while men throw furniture at him. The man who could not stay silent in a boat for 5 minutes will become the most patient liar in literature. The Odyssey is, among other things, the story of that education, and the tuition was paid in this scene. The 12 ships gathered, divided the sheep of Polyphemus fairly, feasted, and slept on the beach. At dawn they rowed out in formation, grieving their dead, glad of their lives, and unaware that a curse was now travelling with them, written into the water under their keels. Their next landfall, for once, looked like genuine good luck. A floating island ringed with a wall of bronze, and on it a happy king with a very unusual gift to give. For 30 days, everything was about to go right, and then a piece of luggage would undo the world, the bag of winds. The island of Aeolia was unlike anything the Greeks had seen. It floated free on the sea, unanchored to the earth, ringed by an unbroken wall of bronze rising from sheer cliffs. Its ruler was Aeolus, and Zeus had given him a unique office in the machinery of the world. He was the keeper of the winds, all of them. Every gale, breeze and hurricane on earth answered to this one cheerful administrator on his floating island. Aeolus lived there with his wife and their 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, and he had solved the problem of finding suitable matches for them in a remote location by simply marrying the 6 sons to the 6 daughters. The whole family feasted together every day in a house rich with good things, and Homer reports this arrangement without a flicker of judgment which perhaps tells us that even the poet decided some questions were better left unasked. More importantly, Aeolus was a good host, a proper one, the first the voyagers had met since leaving Troy. He took Odysseus and his crews in and entertained them for a full month, and every evening he asked for more of the story. Troy, the horse, the sack, the voyage, everything. And when the Greeks finally asked leave to go, Aeolus did something no other host in this entire epic does. He solved the problem. He took the hide of a 9-year-old ox and made of it a great bag, and into that bag he stuffed every wind on earth except one. The whole howling inventory, the northern gales that had wrecked them at Malea, the crosswinds, the storms, all of it, tied shut inside the leather with a bright silver cord, sealed so tightly that not a breath could leak out. Then he stowed the bag in the hold of Odysseus's ship and set the one remaining wind, a steady, gentle breeze from the west, to blow the fleet directly home. It was not a gift so much as a guarantee. With every contrary wind in the world imprisoned in the hold, nothing in the sky could stop them. And nothing in the sky did. For 9 days and 9 nights the west wind carried the 12 ships east without a single incident, the longest stretch of pure good fortune in the whole 10-year voyage. Odysseus, who trusted no one by now, would not let anyone else touch the sheet that controlled the sail. He steered and managed it himself day and night, without sleep, for the entire 9 days. Hold that fact in your mind. 9 days awake, hand on the rope, doing everything personally because it mattered too much to delegate. On the 10th day, they saw Ithaca. Not a distant smudge either. They came in so close that they could see the fires burning on their home island, close enough, the poem implies, to make out figures tending them. 10 years of war and a year of wandering, 600 men reduced by cannibal giants and Ciconian spears, and there it finally was, the actual coastline of home, the harbours they had grown up in, an hour or two of easy sailing away. Some of those fires may have been burning in their own households, and Odysseus, with the end in sight, with the sheet still in his hand, felt the 9 sleepless days land on him all at once. He decided the danger was over. He lay down on the deck, and he slept. What happened next happened quietly, in murmurs, among the crew. There is the captain, asleep at last, and there in the hold is the bag, the mysterious bag he has guarded like treasure the whole way, the bag he will not let anyone touch or even ask about. The men began to talk, and Homer lets us hear the talk. "Look at him," they said. "Everywhere he goes he is honoured and loaded with gifts. He is carrying home piles of plunder from Troy. And what are we carrying home after all the same miles and the same fighting? Empty hands. And now Aeolus has given him this, a bag full of silver and gold, no doubt." And they said to one another, "Let us look, quickly, and see how much treasure is in there." Try, for a moment, to be fair to them. They had rowed and bled through everything their captain had, and they genuinely had nothing to show for it. He had told them nothing about the bag, and secrecy from a man famous for cunning invites exactly one interpretation. They were not mutineers. They were tired, poor, jealous men within sight of their own chimney smoke, taking one quick, unauthorized look at the luggage. 99 times in 100, that story ends with embarrassment, not catastrophe. They untied the silver cord. Every wind on earth came out of the bag at once. The hurricane that erupted from the hold seized all 12 ships and hurled them away from Ithaca as the crews howled in despair, and Odysseus woke into the sound of it, into the sight of his home island being torn away over the horizon by weather he had personally carried aboard. He tells us, in his own words, what passed through him then. He seriously considered stepping over the side and letting the sea have him. He weighed it, drowning against enduring, and chose, in his own flat phrase, to endure, covering his head with his cloak and lying still while the storm blew his life apart. It is perhaps the darkest sentence he speaks in the whole epic, and it is spoken about a moment caused not by a monster or a god, but by his own crew's pettiness and his own decision, at last, to sleep. The storm blew the fleet, with terrible neatness, all the way back to Aeolia, back to the bronze wall and the floating island, back to the very door they had left 10 days before. Odysseus went up to the house of Aeolus with one comrade and a herald, and found the family at dinner, and sat down on the threshold like a beggar. The astonishment in the hall was total. How could he possibly be here? What evil power had done this? And Odysseus told the truth, which for him is always notable. "My accursed crew," he said, "and sleep ruined me. Set it right, my friends, you have the power." The silence that followed was the end of the voyage's luck. Aeolus rose and ordered him out of the house, and the words he used mattered more than the eviction. "Leave this island at once," he said, "most cursed of living men. It is against all law for me to help or host a man so plainly hated by the blessed gods. You come here as proof of their hatred. Go." There it was, spoken aloud for the first time, hated by the gods. Aeolus, a professional in the weather business, had examined the facts. A fair wind home, a 9-day guarantee, and a hurricane out of a sealed bag within sight of the destination, and reached the only available diagnosis. This was not misfortune, this was policy. Somewhere in heaven, someone with jurisdiction had it in for this man, and no sensible host anywhere in the world should touch him. The curse from the cliff top was beginning to show its teeth, not as drama, but as paperwork. Doors would simply close now, everywhere, politely and permanently. The Greeks trudged back to their ships and put out to sea with no wind to help them, because the wind's master had washed his hands of them. For 6 days and nights they rowed, in silence, the crews eating their hearts out, in Homer's phrase, over what they had done to themselves. No one blamed anyone aloud. There was nothing to say. The fires of Ithaca had been visible, and now there was only water and the sound of oars. On the 7th day they raised a coastline, high cliffs enclosing a harbour so sheltered and still that it seemed designed by Providence. 11 ships rode gratefully inside and tied up along the walls. Odysseus, for reasons he never fully explains, some instinct scraped raw by the past year, kept his own ship outside the harbour mouth and made it fast to a rock instead. That decision was about to make him one of the loneliest commanders in the history of the sea. Giants and the loss of the fleet. The harbour was called Telepylus, in the land of the Laestrygonians, and it was, from a sailor's point of view, perfect. Sheer cliffs wrapped it round on every side. 2 headlands nearly met at the mouth, and inside no wave ever rose. 11 exhausted crews looked at that flat, windless water after 6 days at the oars and did the natural thing. They rowed in, moored close together in the calm, and rested. It never seems to have occurred to anyone to ask why a harbour that perfect stood empty, with no ships in it and no town visible, only a thread of smoke rising somewhere inland. Odysseus asked. He did not row in. He tied his own ship to a rock outside the entrance, climbed a crag to look over the country, saw nothing but that smoke, and did what he had done on every strange coast since the Lotus Eaters. He sent 3 men, 2 sailors and a herald, to find out who lived there and whether they ate bread. The scouts followed a wagon road inland, and met, at a spring outside the town, a girl drawing water, a strapping girl, the poem says, the daughter of the local king, Antiphates. They asked her, politely, who ruled this land? She pointed out her family's house, and the scouts walked to it and found inside a woman the size of a mountain peak, who called at once for her husband. The king came home from the assembly, and his idea of receiving foreign visitors was direct. He snatched up one of the sailors and began preparing him for dinner. The other 2 scouts ran for their lives down the wagon road, and behind them the king raised a cry through the town, and the Laestrygonians came out of their houses, thousands of them, not human-sized at all but giants, and the giants did not chase the scouts. They did something far more intelligent. They went to the cliffs. Understand the geometry of what happened next, because it turns the perfect harbour into a perfect trap. 11 ships were moored side by side on still water, enclosed by high rock on every side, with one narrow gate to the sea. The Laestrygonians lined the cliff tops around the entire basin and began tearing boulders loose and dropping them, straight down, onto the packed ships below. There was no cover, no sea room to manoeuvre, no wind to sail, nothing beneath the falling stones but wooden hulls and human beings. Homer compresses the massacre into a few terrible lines. The crash of splintering ships, the cries of dying men, and the giants wading in to spear the swimmers like fish and carry them off, he says plainly, for their ghastly meal. Odysseus, outside the harbour mouth, could hear it all and could do nothing. Nothing but one thing. He drew his sword and cut the cable that held his own ship to the rock and shouted his crew to the oars, and they rowed for open water in terror of their lives while the harbour behind them boiled. His ship, the one ship anchored outside, was the only one that escaped. The arithmetic of that afternoon is worth sitting with, because Homer does not dwell on it, and the speed of the telling can hide the scale. 12 ships had left Troy. 11 of them, and every man aboard them, were destroyed in that harbour in a single hour. Perhaps 500 men, comrades of 10 years of war and a year of wandering, gone between one meal and the next. The fleet of Ithaca now consisted of 1 galley and some 45 souls. Everyone else who had sailed away from home a decade before, the neighbours, the cousins, the boys who had grown to manhood on the beaches of Troy, ended in the bellies of giants in a nameless fjord beyond the edge of the map. When the Ithacans in later years counted the cost of Troy, this hour was most of it. And notice, because the poem quietly insists on it, what saved the one ship. Not strength, not divine favour, certainly not luck. A decision. Odysseus had looked at a perfect harbour and declined it, on no evidence at all, purely because a year of catastrophe had taught him that perfect things offered to tired men are usually bait. Paranoia is an ugly word for it. The Odyssey would call it having learned. The captain who slept within sight of Ithaca does not sleep here, and the difference between those two men is 11 ships. The lone ship fled on across empty water, and Homer gives them the strangest, saddest sentence of respite. Glad to have escaped death, he says, but grieving for their dear companions. Glad and grieving, in the same breath, which is perhaps the most honest description of survival ever written. In time they raised a low wooded island and beached the ship on its shore. For 2 days and 2 nights the survivors simply lay by their vessel and ate their hearts out with exhaustion and sorrow, doing nothing at all, which after the year they had endured may have been the wisest command Odysseus never had to give. On the 3rd day he took spear and sword and climbed to a lookout, and saw smoke rising from a house deep in the forest. He debated going straight to it, and decided instead to feed his men first, and Providence, for once, cooperated. A huge stag crossed his path on the way down to the ship, and he killed it and carried it back across his shoulders, and the crew feasted on the beach and slept. At dawn he called them together and told them the truth of their position, which was that he did not know their position. "Friends," he said, "we do not know east from west here, where the sun sets or where it rises. We are off every chart. There was smoke inland, and someone made it, and the only way forward was to find out who." The men, hearing this, broke down and wailed aloud, and Homer tells us exactly why. They remembered the last 3 times someone had gone to see who made the smoke: the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops, the Laestrygonians. In their experience, smoke on the horizon meant that some of them were about to be eaten. It was not cowardice, it was pattern recognition. Odysseus, unmoved, did what commanders do with unbearable decisions. He randomized it. He divided the survivors into 2 platoons of 22 men each, one under himself, the other under his second in command, a big, brave, somewhat unsteady kinsman named Eurylochus. They shook lots in a bronze helmet, and the lot that jumped out was Eurylochus's. So Eurylochus and his 22 marched inland, weeping as they went, and their comrades wept watching them go, and the forest closed behind them. Deep in a clearing they found a house of polished stone, and around it, wonder of wonders, prowled mountain wolves and lions, which did not attack but rose on their hind legs and fawned on the visitors like dogs greeting a master come home from dinner, wagging and cringing in a way that was somehow worse than a charge. From inside the house came the sound of a woman singing, a lovely voice, weaving at a great loom. The men called out. The doors opened on a gracious lady who invited them in to food and rest, and the whole platoon trooped happily inside. All but one. Eurylochus, smelling a trap at last, exactly one house too late in his life to be useful, stayed outside and watched through the door. What he saw sent him running back through the forest to the ship, so shattered he could barely speak. The lady of the house was named Circe, and the men who had gone in were no longer, strictly speaking, men. Circe's island. The island was called Aea, and its mistress was no ordinary woman. Circe was a goddess, a minor one by Olympian standards, but a genuine one, daughter of Helios, the sun itself, and aunt of the infamous Medea. She lived alone in her stone house in the forest with her loom, her song, her tame predators, and her particular hobby, which Eurylochus had just watched in operation through the doorway. She had welcomed the 22 sailors in, seated them, and served them a dish of cheese, barley, honey, and wine. Into it, she had stirred a drug that made them forget their native land, and when they had eaten, she struck them with a wand, and they became pigs. Bristles, snouts, bodies, voices, everything porcine except the one thing that mattered. Their minds stayed human. She penned them in her styes, weeping pig tears with human understanding, and threw them acorns, and went back to her weaving. The wolves and lions in the yard, it was now clear, had been travellers too. Back at the beach, Eurylochus choked out what he had seen, or as much as he could, and begged Odysseus to launch the ship and abandon the transformed men while escape was still possible. It was, from a purely actuarial point of view, sound advice. Odysseus refused it. He slung on his sword, took his bow, and ordered Eurylochus to lead him back to the house. And when the man clung to his knees and refused, Odysseus let him stay and went alone. There is no plan in his head at this point, and the poem is honest about that. One man with a sword was going to visit a goddess who turned platoons into livestock, and his strategy amounted to being angry about it. He was saved by an intervention. On the path through the forest, a young man appeared, and it was the god Hermes in disguise, sent, we later learn, at Athena's quiet prompting. Hermes told Odysseus plainly that he was walking to his doom, and then, being a practical god, handed him the solution. He pulled from the earth a plant the gods call moly, black at the root with a flower white as milk, hard for mortals to dig, and gave it to Odysseus as an antidote. With moly in his system, Circe's drug would fail, and Hermes scripted the scene that must follow. When her wand falls and nothing happens, draw your sword and rush her as if to kill. She will offer her bed. Do not refuse a goddess, but make her first swear the great oath of the gods to plot no further harm, or she will unman you even so. It all unfolded exactly to script, which is one of the pleasures of having a god write your evening. Circe served the drugged cup. Odysseus drank it down without effect. The wand fell, and instead of trotting to the sty, the stranger came at her with drawn sword. Circe shrieked, ducked under the blade, seized his knees, and asked the question that has echoed strangely ever since. Who are you, that my drugs cannot touch? You must be Odysseus, the man of many turns. Hermes always told me he would come, on his way home from Troy. It is a chilly little revelation, dropped in passing. The witch had his itinerary in advance. His arrival on her island was, in some register, kept above the mortal world, scheduled. She swore the oath he demanded, and he took her offer, and her 4 maidservants bathed the salt off him and set a feast, and Odysseus sat before the food and would not eat. Circe asked why. His answer is one of his best moments. How could any decent man eat and drink, he said, before his companions were free. Turn them back, and let me see them. So she went out to the sties with her wand, and drove the pigs in, and anointed each with a second drug, and the bristles fell away, and they were men again, younger, taller, and handsomer than before. The poem insists, and they knew Odysseus and wept, every man of them, and the goddess herself was moved by the sound of it. Then Circe did something no one expected. She invited the entire crew. "Bring your ship ashore," she said. "Stow your gear in the caves, and bring the rest of your men to my house." And Odysseus went back for them, and all but talked down Eurylochus, who was against it, understandably, having seen the sty from the visitor side, and the whole surviving company of Ithaca moved in with the witch who had bewitched them. What followed is the strangest passage of time in the Odyssey. They stayed a year, not imprisoned, not enchanted, not, as far as the poem tells us, drugged. They feasted every day on abundant meat and sweet wine in the house of the goddess, and the days folded into seasons, and the seasons folded into a full circle of the year, and nobody said the word Ithaca. The men who had wept within sight of their island's fires sat by warm hearths eating well, and the man who had refused a magic fruit because it caused forgetting settled into a goddess's bed and forgot on his own. No lotus required. Comfort, it turns out, does not need pharmacology. It ended the way these things often end, with the followers nudging the leader. His men took him aside, and their words have a gentle, careful sound, the sound of people waking a sleepwalker. "Strange man," they said, "remember your fatherland now, if it is really fated that you reach it." And Odysseus woke. That evening he went to Circe, held her knees, and asked her to keep her old promise and send him home. She did not argue, did not weep, did not bargain, which sets her apart from nearly everyone else who ever hosted him. But she told him something that dropped the bottom out of the room. "You need not stay in my house unwilling," she said, "but there is another journey you must make first. Before you can sail home, you must sail to the house of Hades and dread Persephone, to the land of the dead, and consult the ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias of Thebes, who alone among the dead keeps his understanding. He will tell you your way." Odysseus, hearing this, says his heart broke, and he sat on the bed and wept and wanted no more of life, and no one can blame him. No living man had made that voyage. Asking the way home and being told the route ran through death itself was the cruelest joke the cosmos had played on him yet. When he could speak, he asked the practical question he always asks: who will pilot us? No ship has ever sailed to Hades, and Circe gave the eerie answer that no pilot was needed. "Raise your mast, set your sail, and sit still. The north wind will carry you there." She gave him precise ritual instructions, the trench, the offerings, the black ram and black ewe, which we will watch him perform in the next part of our story. And in the morning, as the crew was mustering to leave, the voyage collected one more soul in the least dignified way imaginable. The youngest of the company, a sailor named Elpenor, not much of a fighter, Homer says, and not overburdened with brains, had drunk heavily the night before and gone up to sleep on the flat roof of Circe's house for the cool air. Woken suddenly by the bustle of departure, he forgot where he was, stepped off the roof instead of taking the ladder, and broke his neck. In an epic populated by men killed by giants, gods, and monsters, Elpenor died of hangover and architecture, the only casualty in Homer for whom the fatal enemy was a staircase he failed to locate. His shipmates, hurrying for the beach, did not even stop to bury him. That omission was about to become important. The ship stood out from Aeaea with a fair wind the goddess sent behind it, and the crew learned, only once they were at sea, where that wind was taking them. They wept, Homer says, and tore their hair. The bow was pointed at the edge of the world, and past it. Next stop, the country of the dead, the house of Hades. The ship ran all day before Circe's wind, and at sunset it came to the limit of the world, the deep flowing river of ocean that the Greeks believed circled all lands. Beyond it lay the country of the Cimmerians, a people wrapped forever in mist and cloud, on whom the sun never looks, and past their fog-bound coast, the entrance to the world below. It is a geography of pure dread, and Homer paints it in grey on grey. No monster guards this border. The border is simply the end of light. They beached the ship and carried the offerings Circe had provided to the place she had described, where two roaring rivers of the underworld meet at a rock. There Odysseus dug a trench with his sword, a cubit long and a cubit wide, and around it poured the triple libation to all the dead. First honey mixed with milk, then sweet wine, then water, and sprinkled white barley over it, and made his prayers and promises to the strengthless dead. Then he cut the throats of the black ram and the black ewe over the trench, and the dark blood ran down into it, and the dead came. They came up out of the gloom of Erebus in crowds, drawn to the blood, and the poem's list of them still chills. Brides who died young, and boys and old men worn by long grief, and girls with sorrow fresh in their hearts, and ranks of warriors killed in battle, still wearing their blood-stained armour, drifting around the trench from every side with a sound, Homer says, like a vast inhuman crying, and pale fear took hold of Odysseus. His job, and it is a horrible one, was doorman. Circe had told him that any ghost who drank the blood would regain, for a while, memory and speech, and that he must hold his drawn sword over the trench and let none of them drink before Tiresias, the one he had come for. So he crouched there in the dark at the edge of the world, holding a sword over a puddle of blood, rationing brief moments of remembered life to the crowding dead. The first ghost was not one he expected. It was Elpenor, the young sailor who had walked off Circe's roof the previous morning, arrived in Hades ahead of them, because a ghost travels faster than a galley. He did not need the blood to speak, being newly dead, and he asked for the only thing the dead can ask. "Do not sail away and leave my body unwept and unburied at Circe's house," he begged, "or the god's anger will fall on you. Burn me with my armour, heap a mound over me by the grey sea, and plant on it the oar I pulled in life beside my companions." Odysseus promised all of it, and kept the promise, and so the least of his men received the epic's most touching funeral request, a monument of one oar. Then, before the prophet, came a ghost that nearly broke him. His mother, Anticlea. She had been alive when he sailed for Troy. She sat now among the shadows across the trench, and he could not let her drink, not yet, not before Tiresias, and so he had to hold his sword between himself and his own mother while she waited. Silent and unknowing, at the edge of the blood, he says he wept. It is difficult to imagine the discipline of that moment, and the poem does not let us look away from it. Tiresias came at last, the blind seer of Thebes, carrying his golden staff, the one soul in Hades permitted to keep his wits. He drank, and then he told Odysseus everything, and it is worth setting out plainly, because it is the road map of the rest of this story and beyond. "Poseidon hates you for the blinding of his son," he said, "and will make your way bitter, but you may yet come home, late and hard, if you can hold one thing: restraint. You will come to the island of Thrinacia, where the sun keeps his cattle. If you leave them unharmed, you may all reach Ithaca. If you harm them, I foresee destruction for your ship and your crew, and if you yourself escape, you will come home late, broken, on a stranger's ship, having lost all companions, to find trouble in your house, arrogant men devouring your goods and courting your wife. You will pay them back in blood." The prophecy repeats Polyphemus's curse almost word for word, and that is the point. The curse has been ratified. It is now simply the future. And then Tiresias went past the story we are telling, into territory the Odyssey itself never reaches. "After the reckoning in your hall," he said, "you must take up a well-fitted oar and walk inland, away from the sea, until you come to a people who know nothing of ships or salt, where a traveller will meet you and say that the thing on your shoulder is a winnowing fan for grain. There, plant the oar in the earth, sacrifice to Poseidon, and go home. Death will come to you off the sea, or away from it. The phrase is ambiguous, and was argued about for centuries. A gentle death in sleek old age, with your people prosperous around you. It is a strange and beautiful ending to hang out beyond the poem's horizon, the sailor walking until the sea is forgotten, making his final peace with the god of it. Business done, Odysseus let his mother drink. She knew him then, and asked how a living man had come to that place, and he asked the question he was afraid of, and she answered it. "Your father Laertes lives," she said, "but in misery, on the farm, sleeping in ashes by the fire in winter, and on leaves in the vineyard in summer, grieving for you. Your son holds your lands. Your wife remains in your halls faithful, and her nights are one long weeping. And I," she said, "did not die of sickness. I died of longing for you, my shining one. It was missing you that took the honey of life from me." 3 times Odysseus reached out to embrace her, and 3 times she drifted through his arms like a shadow or a dream. And when he cried out at the cruelty of it, she explained, gently, that this is simply what the dead are. The sinews no longer hold flesh and bone. The spirit flies away like a dream. It is the tenderest and bleakest scene in the whole epic, and every literature since has borrowed it. After her came a procession. Persephone sent up the famous women of the old stories, queens and mothers of heroes, each drinking and telling her tale. And then came the men of Troy, and the reunions turned the knife one by one. Agamemnon the high king came weeping, and told Odysseus what had been waiting for him at home, the bath, the butchery, his wife's hand in it, and gave his bitter advice. "Trust no woman entirely," he said, "and come home to your own harbour secretly, not openly. Though your Penelope," he added, "is not such a one. Still, secretly." Achilles came, the greatest of them, and Odysseus tried to comfort him. "Do not grieve at death," he said. "We honoured you like a god alive, and now you rule among the dead." The answer Achilles gave is one of the most famous speeches in Greek literature, and it detonates the entire value system he died for. "Do not talk up death to me, shining Odysseus. I would rather be the hired hand of a poor tenant farmer, alive on the earth than king over all the perished dead." The man who chose a short glorious life over a long obscure one had seen the other side of the bargain, and he wanted his money back. He brightened only once, when Odysseus told him his son Neoptolemus had fought bravely at Troy, and the ghost strode away across the fields of Asphodel, rejoicing in his boy. One ghost would not come. Great Ajax stood apart, silent, still furious over the armour of Achilles, awarded to Odysseus, that had driven him to suicide. Odysseus called to him with real remorse, wishing he had never won that prize, begging him to speak. Ajax turned without a word and walked into the dark. In a poem built out of speeches, it is the most devastating exit anyone makes, an anger that death itself could not soften. Deeper in, Odysseus glimpsed the famous machinery of the afterlife, Minos judging the dead with his golden sceptre, Tantalus in his pool, water to his chin, fruit above his head, both flinching away forever from his thirst and hunger, Sisyphus heaving his boulder up the hill, and the boulder rolling shamelessly down again, and the shade of Heracles, gloomy even in glory, who recognized in Odysseus a fellow sufferer of impossible labours. Then the nations of the dead began to gather toward the blood in numbers past counting, with their immense crying, and the nerve of even Odysseus reached its end. Pale terror took him, he says, that Persephone might send up the Gorgon's head out of the dark, and he ran for the ship, and the crew bent to the oars, and the current of ocean, and then a rising wind carried the living out of the country of the dead. He had gone down for directions. He came back up with something else, which every listener of this poem receives along with him. He had seen what everything costs. Glory from the mouth of Achilles. Homecoming from the mouth of Agamemnon. Waiting from the mouth of his mother. The rest of his voyage and everything he endures in it is done by a man who knows the price list. The ship ran east over the grey water, back toward the sun, back toward Circe's island, where a promise to a dead sailor with an oar was waiting to be kept. Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis. They came back to Aea in darkness and slept on the beach, and at dawn they kept the promise made in Hades. They cut Elpenor's body down, burned him with his armour, raised a mound over the ashes by the grey sea, and planted his oar on top of it, exactly as his ghost had asked. Circe came down to the shore with bread and meat and wine, and greeted them with a line that manages to be both warm and unnerving. "Reckless men," she said, "who have gone down alive to the house of Hades. You will be twice dead when everyone else dies once." That night, while the crew slept, she took Odysseus aside, and what she gave him was something no one else on this voyage ever received: a briefing. Item by item, she described every danger on the road ahead, what it looked like, how it worked, and what to do about it. The Sirens first, then a choice of 2 sea passages, and past them the island of the Sunday. She even told him where his own judgment would fail and what to do about that. It is worth noticing what has happened to this relationship. The witch who turned his men into pigs has become the single most useful ally Odysseus has. He came to her island with a sword and left it with an intelligence report. At dawn they sailed, and the first test came quickly. The wind died to a flat calm, which Circe had predicted, because the Sirens make their own weather. The Sirens were 2 creatures on a flowering meadow of an island, and their weapon was a song. Any sailor who heard it turned his ship to the sound and was lost, and around their meadow lay the proof, a heap of rotting men, the skin shrivelling on their bones. What the song offered was not pleasure. Circe and the Sirens themselves are precise about this. The Sirens sang knowledge. We know everything that happened at Troy. They sang to Odysseus by name as he passed. We know everything that comes to pass on the fruitful earth. Come, hear, and sail on wiser. It was a library that ate people. For a man of insatiable curiosity, it was the most personally targeted trap on the route. The defence, prescribed by Circe, has become one of the most famous images in the world. Odysseus took a wheel of beeswax, cut it up, and kneaded it soft in the Mediterranean sun, and plugged the ears of every rower. The crew could hear nothing. Then, because Circe had told him he alone might listen if he wished, and because he was Odysseus and of course he wished, he had his men bind him upright to the mast, wrists and ankles, and gave a standing order: "If I beg you to release me, bind me tighter." Then they rowed into the calm. The song came across the water, and it worked exactly as advertised, even on a forewarned man. Odysseus strained against the ropes and signalled with his brows for release, ordered it, begged for it. And the system he had designed against his own future self held firm. 2 of the crew, Perimedes and Eurylochus, got up and tied him tighter, as instructed. The ship passed, the song faded, the wax came out, the ropes came off. He is the only man in mythology who heard the Sirens and lived, and he managed it by the most modern of methods, making a binding decision while sane about what he would be permitted to do while tempted. Philosophers and economists still call this kind of arrangement a Ulysses contract, using his Latin name, and it is used today in medicine and law, several thousand years after a fictional sailor invented it with rope. Beyond the Sirens, the sea itself began to smoke and thunder, and the crew, hearing it, dropped their oars in terror, and Odysseus walked the deck talking them back to their benches. "We have been in worse," he told them. "This is not more terrible than the Cyclops' cave." It was a carefully selected truth. What he did not tell them, and he admits this to us directly, was what Circe had said about the passage ahead, because there was nothing they could do about it, and men cannot row and despair at the same time. The passage was a strait, and modern tradition has always placed it, plausibly enough, at the narrow, turbulent Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily. On one side stood a low rock with a great fig tree, and under it, 3 times a day, a whirlpool called Charybdis swallowed the sea entire, and 3 times a day vomited it back, and when she swallowed, ships went down with the water and did not come back. No skill availed against her. She was simply a mouth in the ocean. On the other side rose a sheer cliff, its peak in permanent cloud, and halfway up it, a cave. In the cave lived Scylla. Homer builds her carefully, 12 dangling legs. 6 necks of enormous length, each ending in a head with 3 rows of packed teeth. She yelped, unexpectedly, with a voice like a newborn puppy, a detail that somehow makes everything worse. She could not be fought, could not be dodged, could not be outrun. Her method was fixed and dreadful. From every ship that passed within reach, each of her 6 heads took 1 man. Here was the choice Circe had laid out, and it is the coldest piece of arithmetic in ancient literature. Steer wide of Scylla, toward Charybdis, and risk the whirlpool taking the whole ship and every soul aboard. Or hug Scylla's cliff and lose 6 men. Not perhaps 6, 6. Odysseus had asked Circe, when she briefed him, whether he could not somehow fight Scylla off and lose no one, and her answer was the whole lesson of his life compressed into a sentence. "Stubborn man," she said, "always war and battle. Will you not yield even to the immortals? She is not mortal, she is an undying evil. There is no defence. The only course is flight, and the only question is the size of the loss. Row hard, and while you row, call on her mother to keep her from striking twice." So he chose, as every captain in his position must, and he chose the 6. He put on his armour anyway, and stood in the bow with 2 spears scanning the cliff, knowing it was useless, unable to be the kind of man who does not try. The ship entered the strait hugging the rock, every eye aboard fixed in horror on the other side, where Charybdis was in full swallow, the sea roiling down her throat and the spray raining down on the mast, the exposed sand of the bottom showing black at the vortex's heart. And while every man watched the whirlpool, Scylla took her toll from behind them. 6 heads came down, and 6 men went up, and Odysseus turned at their cry and saw them lifted high above the deck, writhing, calling his name, stretching their hands down to him, and there was nothing to be done but row. She devoured them at the mouth of her cave, he tells us, still reaching for him, still calling. "Of everything I suffered on all the seas," he says, "that was the most pitiful sight my eyes ever saw." It is the one loss on the voyage that he chose in advance, with full knowledge, as the price of everyone else, and you can hear in the telling that the trade never stopped costing him. The ship shot out of the strait into open water, 39 men where 45 had been, and ahead, low and green on the horizon, an island appeared, and from far off across the water they could hear the lowing of cattle, beautiful broad-browed cattle in vast herds, with a sound of home and pasture and ordinary life about it. Every man aboard had been warned about this island twice, once by a prophet in hell and once by a goddess on a beach. The warnings agreed exactly, and the crew was starving, and the cattle were fat, and the 2 warnings and the 1 hunger were about to have it out. The cattle of the Sunday. The island was Thrinacia, and the herds on it belonged to Helios, the sun, the god who sees everything that happens on earth, because looking down at it is, in the most literal sense, his job. 7 herds of cattle and 7 flocks of sheep, 50 head in each, numbers that never grew and never shrank, tended by 2 nymphs, his daughters. Immortal livestock, sacred, inventoried, and under permanent aerial surveillance. There has never been a worse place in world literature to steal a cow. Odysseus did not want to stop there at all. Standing off the coast, he repeated to the crew what Tiresias and Circe had both told him, that this island held the most terrible danger of the whole voyage, and gave the order to row straight past. And for the first time on the voyage, the crew formally refused. Their spokesman was Eurylochus, the second in command, and his speech is mutiny conducted entirely in the language of reasonableness. "You are made of iron," he told Odysseus, "never tired, and we are exhausted men who have not slept. Night is coming, and night winds wreck ships, and you would have us row on into darkness past a safe beach. Let us land, cook supper, sleep by the ship, and sail at dawn." The whole crew shouted agreement, and Odysseus understood, he tells us, that some god was working ruin, because he had lost the argument before it started. He extracted the only concession available. every man swore a solemn oath. They would touch nothing on the island, not one cow, not one sheep. They would eat only the provisions Circe had given them, and leave at first light. That night, while they slept on the beach, Zeus sent the storm. It blew from the south for a night, and then it simply did not stop. For one entire month, 30 days, the south wind and the east wind took turns sealing the island shut. No ship of that age could beat out against it. The Greeks were pinned on Thrinacia, and day by day Circe's provisions ran down to crumbs, and then to nothing. The men scattered along the shore with hooks and snares, catching what fish and birds they could, and hunger of the genuine kind, the kind that hollows the face and unhinges the judgment, moved into the camp and settled down among the oaths. And all around them, morning and evening, the fat, glossy, forbidden cattle grazed within a spear's throw. Uncountable meals on the hoof, guarded by nothing but a promise. Notice the trap's design, because it is designed. Tiresias had said if you harm the cattle, and a prophecy of that kind does not wait passively to see what happens. The month of contrary wind is the mechanism by which the if becomes the outcome. The gods of this poem do not force men's hands. They arrange circumstances in which men's own natures will do the forcing, and then they wait. The crew that opened the bag of winds out of hungry envy is now being starved, methodically, next to an all-you-can-eat sacrilege. Odysseus held them for the full month, which may be the most underrated feat of leadership in the epic. Then he made the mistake that was waiting for him. He went inland, alone, to a sheltered spot out of the wind, to pray to the gods for a way off the island. The gods answered the prayer with their own dark humour. They poured sleep over his eyelids. The one man whose wakefulness had been holding the line was switched off, gently, at the decisive moment, exactly as he had been within sight of Ithaca. If you want to know whether the gods of this story play fair, there is your answer. On the beach, Eurylochus saw his chance and made the speech of his life to the starving crew. All deaths are hateful, he said, but death by hunger is the most miserable of all. Let us drive off the best of these cattle and sacrifice them properly to the gods, with all the rites, and vow that when we reach Ithaca we will build Helios, a splendid temple in repayment. And if the sun is angry enough to sink our ship, well then, I would rather gulp the sea and die in one moment than waste away by inches on a desert island. It is a genuinely persuasive speech. It offers piety, restitution, and a preference for quick death over slow. And every starving man on that beach voted yes with his feet. They cut out the finest of the sun's cattle and killed them, and the scene Homer gives us is a sacrifice gone wrong in every physical detail, ritual as nightmare. They had no barley for the sprinkling, so they used oak leaves. No wine for the libation, so they poured water. The forms of worship performed with the wrong materials, over stolen offerings, to buy pardon for the theft in progress. And then the world itself began to object. The flayed hides crawled along the ground. The meat on the spits lowed, raw and roasted alike, with the voices of cattle. The men ate anyway. They feasted on the bellowing meat for 6 days, which is perhaps the most quietly horrifying sentence in the poem. Hunger will make men do what gods forbid, but it takes something darker to go back for seconds while dinner is audibly complaining. Odysseus woke, smelled the roasting fat on the wind, and knew everything before he reached the beach. His cry to the gods has the sound of a man at the end of a long rope. You lulled me to sleep to ruin me. Up on Olympus, the accounting was already in motion. The nymph herdsmaids had run to their father, and Helios stood before Zeus with an ultimatum that shows exactly how much leverage the sun carries. Punish the men who killed my cattle, he demanded, or I will go down and shine among the dead instead, and light the underworld, a solar strike. Zeus, facing the prospect of the sun leaving the sky over an insurance dispute, gave his word. Sail on, old friend. I will handle the ship personally. On the 7th day the wind finally dropped, and the Greeks launched at once and stood out to sea, and for a little while the island sank astern and hope came back aboard. Then, when they were out of sight of all land, with nothing but sky and water in every direction, Zeus parked a blue-black cloud directly over the ship, and the sea went dark beneath it. The end came with terrible efficiency. A screaming squall from the west snapped both forestays, and the mast went over backward, its rigging crashing into the bilge, and the falling spar struck the helmsman's skull and dropped him dead over the side. Then Zeus threw the thunderbolt. The ship hit amidships, spun and filled with sulphur, and every man aboard went into the water, and Homer gives the crew of Odysseus their final image. Bobbing around the black hull like seabirds on the waves, the god taking away their homecoming, until one by one the sea collected them. Every prophecy, every warning, every oath had come to this. Of the 600 or so who sailed from Troy, the count of the living now stood at 1. Odysseus survived by shipwright's instinct. He lashed the floating mast and keel together with a leather backstay and rode the wreckage like a raft. And then the wind swung to the south and delivered the punchline of the god's cruelty. It blew him backward all night, straight to the strait, straight to Charybdis, and he arrived exactly as she began her morning swallow. The whirlpool took his raft down. Odysseus leapt, caught the branches of the great fig tree overhanging the vortex, and hung there, clinging like a bat, he says, with nothing below his feet but the spinning throat of the sea, waiting the hours until Charybdis vomited the waters back. His timbers finally shot up out of the deep, and he dropped, hit the water beside them, climbed on, and paddled out of the strait with his hands. Scylla on her cliff never saw him. A god, he says simply, hid him from her. Even Poseidon's curse, it seems, respected the technicality. He had to live. For 9 days he drifted on his lashed-together spars across an empty sea. On the 10th night, the gods brought him ashore on a wooded island at the navel of the ocean, the home of a goddess who lived alone, and who would look at the half-drowned, salt-crusted, sole survivor washed onto her beach and decide, with the whole heart of an immortal, that she was going to keep him. The island was Ogygia. We have been here before, in the very first minutes of tonight's story. The wanderings are over. The waiting is about to begin. 7 years with Calypso, Ogygia was, by every account, a paradise. A cave hung with vines heavy with grapes, meadows of violets and wild parsley, 4 springs of clear water running off in 4 directions, alders and poplars and sweet-smelling cypress full of nesting birds. Homer says that even a god arriving there would stop and stare in wonder, and one eventually does exactly that. Its only inhabitant was Calypso, a goddess, daughter of the Titan Atlas, living in exile at the far edge of the sea, alone with her loom and her garden. Her name comes from a Greek word meaning to hide or to conceal, and that is precisely what she did with the man the sea delivered to her. For 7 years, as far as the world knew, Odysseus had ceased to exist. Understand what she offered him, because it was the largest offer any mortal in Greek myth ever received. Not just her bed, and not just the island. Immortality. She would make him ageless and deathless, her husband forever in a garden at the end of the world. Every terror of the human condition cancelled. The fate that took Achilles waived. The old age waiting for him waived. All he had to do was stop wanting Ithaca. And here is the extraordinary thing, the thing that makes Odysseus who he is. He said no. Not once, in a grand dramatic scene, but continuously, quietly, for 7 years, in the only way available to a mortal with no ship, which was to remain in grief. The nights, Homer tells us with his usual honesty, Odysseus spent in the goddess's bed, unwilling beside the willing, because she was a goddess, and he was her guest and prisoner, and the poem does not pretend a captive has clean choices. But the days he spent alone on the headland, sitting on the rocks, looking east across the water, and weeping. 7 years of that. The man of many devices, the escape artist of the age, out of devices, with nothing left of his cleverness but the refusal to be consoled. It is worth pausing on the choice itself, because the poem clearly wants us to. Calypso, when it all comes to a head, puts the comparison to him directly and without malice. "I am telling you," she says, "that if you knew the sufferings still waiting between here and your homeland, you would stay with me and be immortal. And besides," she adds, with an immortal's frankness, "I am surely not inferior to your wife in form or stature. Mortal women cannot compete with goddesses in beauty." Every word of it is true, and Odysseus's answer is the hinge of the whole epic. "Goddess," he says, "I know it. All of it is just as you say. Wise Penelope is less than you to look upon, for she is mortal and you are deathless and unaging. But even so, what I want, every day, is to go home and to see the day of my return. And if some god wrecks me again on the wine-dark sea, I will bear it. I have suffered much already. Let this be added to the rest." Read that answer again slowly, because it is one of the great statements of what it means to be human. He does not pretend the island is not beautiful, or the goddess not superior, or the sea not dangerous. He concedes every point, and chooses Ithaca anyway. He chooses a mortal wife over an immortal lover, an old age over an eternal youth, a difficult real life over a perfect suspended one. The lotus in section 6 erased the desire for home from the outside. Calypso's offer tests whether that desire can dissolve from the inside, given 7 years of paradise to soak in. It cannot. Scholars sometimes say the whole Odyssey is contained in this one scene, and they are not wrong. It is the story of a man who was offered everything, and asked instead for his own life back. The rescue, when it finally came, started far away, in a committee meeting. On Olympus, with Poseidon conveniently absent, feasting with the Ethiopians at the edge of the world, Athena raised the case of Odysseus before Zeus and the assembled gods. Her speech is a masterpiece of targeted indignation. "What is the point," she asked, "of any king being gentle and just if this is his reward? Odysseus rots on an island, held by a nymph, weeping for a home he cannot reach, and his son is now in danger too, for the suitors on Ithaca are plotting to murder the boy." Zeus, prodded, agreed that the time had come, and the machinery of fate finally turned. Hermes, the messenger, was dispatched across the sea, skimming the waves like a seabird, to deliver to Calypso the decision of the management. The scene between the two immortals is one of Homer's finest. Hermes arrived at the lovely cave, found the goddess weaving and singing, cedar and juniper burning fragrant on her hearth, and Odysseus, as ever, off on the shore crying. Over refreshments, because even divine ultimatums observe hospitality, Hermes delivered the message. Zeus says the man must go. It is not fated that he die here. His destiny is to see his people and his home. And Calypso's reply, before she yielded, is the closest thing in Homer to a feminist protest, lodged on Olympus 2,700 years early. "You gods are jealous," she said, "and merciless. You male gods take mortal women whenever you please, but let a goddess love a mortal man, and you begrudge it every time." And she listed the precedents like a lawyer, goddesses whose mortal lovers the gods had struck down. "And now you envy me my man, whom I saved, riding his keel alone in the sea after Zeus himself had smashed his ship. Very well. Let him go, if Zeus commands it. But I cannot send him. I have no ships, no crews. I can only give him advice, and hide nothing." She kept her word with a grace that redeems her whole captaincy of that island. She found Odysseus on the shore and told him to grieve no more. She was sending him home, and his first reaction was pure Odysseus. He did not believe her. He refused to set foot on any raft until she swore the great oath of the gods that this was not some new trick against him. And Calypso smiled, stroked his cheek, called him incorrigible, and swore it, by the Styx, the oath no god can break. That evening they dined together a last time, she on ambrosia, he on mortal food, and she made her final offer of immortality, and heard his final answer, and let it be. Then, for 4 days, the goddess and the man built a boat. She gave him a great bronze axe and an adze, and led him to the tallest trees on the island, alder and poplar and fir, long dead and dry, the best wood for floating. He felled 20 of them, trimmed and smoothed, and joined them with pegs and mortises, decked the craft, stepped a mast, hung a steering oar, and fenced the sides with willow against the waves. And Calypso brought cloth for the sail and provisioned the boat with water, wine, grain, and cooked meats. Homer, whose audience knew boats the way we know cars, lingers lovingly over every joint and plank. This is important. The last ship of Odysseus was not given to him. He built it, with his own hands, plank by plank, the king becoming carpenter to earn his way back into the world. On the 5th day she bathed him, dressed him in fragrant clothes, sent a warm, fair wind behind him, and stood on the shore of her hidden island and watched the raft dwindle east. She had loved him for 7 years and released him in 4 days, and of all the beings who ever held Odysseus against his will, she is the only one the story allows a broken heart. Odysseus sailed alone for 17 days and nights, never sleeping, steering by the stars she had named for him, keeping the Great Bear on his left hand as instructed. On the 18th day, a coastline rose ahead, like a shield laid on the misty sea. The land of the Phaeacians, his last stop before home, though he did not know it. And at that exact moment, returning from Ethiopia, Poseidon looked down from the mountains of a distant shore and saw, sailing calmly across his sea, the one mortal he hated most in the world, the last shipwreck and the princess. Poseidon's reaction, on seeing his enemy 17 days from freedom, was a growl of pure grievance. So, the gods have changed their minds about Odysseus while I was away at dinner. Very well. He is fated to reach the Phaeacians, and I cannot stop that, but I can still give him his fill of trouble first. And the god of the sea picked up his trident and went to work on the weather personally. What he built over that small raft was every storm at once. East wind, south wind, west wind, and the north wind together, driving the sea into chaos from all quarters. Odysseus's knees went loose, and he spoke aloud the wish that shipwrecked men have spoken ever since, that he had died at Troy, on land, with an army around him and a funeral after, instead of alone out here for a fish's dinner. A wave broke the steering oar from his hands, snapped the mast and blew him bodily off the raft, and his heavy sea clothes dragged him far under before he fought back to the surface, spitting brine, and hauled himself onto the disintegrating platform of logs. His rescue came from an unexpected quarter of the sea. A white seabird lit on the wreck, and it was Ino, once a mortal woman, now a minor goddess of the waves, and she took pity on him. Her advice was drastic. "The raft is finished," she said. "Strip off those clothes, take my veil, wind it around your chest and swim. It cannot sink you. And when you reach land, throw it back into the sea and look away." Odysseus, being Odysseus, suspected a trap even in mid-catastrophe, and decided to stay with the raft as long as 2 planks held together, which shortly they did not. A comber the size of a hillside blew the timbers apart like chaff. He rode a single beam like a horse, stripped, bound the veil around himself, and went into the sea. He swam for 2 days and 2 nights in the swell, kept alive by the veil and by Athena, who quietly flattened the winds and put a steady northern push behind him. When at last he raised the coast, it nearly killed him. There was no harbour, only reefs and cliffs with the sea exploding white against them, and his first attempt to land ended with a wave hurling him onto a rock face, where he clung with torn hands until the backwash ripped him off and dragged him out again, leaving his skin on the stone the way an octopus leaves pebbles stuck to its suckers when you pull it from its hole. That is Homer's image, not mine, and it has been making listeners wince for 2,700 years. Swimming along the coast outside the surf, he found at last a river mouth, and prayed to the river god, and the river stilled its current and let him crawl ashore. The man who came out of that water was a king of nothing, naked, swollen with brine, sea water running from his mouth and nostrils, without ship, crew, clothes, or possessions. He had been stripped by the sea of every single thing he owned, except his life and his mind. He kissed the earth, threw Ino's veil back into the waves as promised, and then solved his last problem of the day like the survivor he was. Night was coming, and a naked, exhausted man dies of exposure by a cold river. He found 2 olive bushes grown into one thicket, one wild and one cultivated, a detail the poem loves, burrowed into the deep drift of dead leaves beneath them, and buried himself like a live coal banked in ashes on a lonely farm. Athena poured sleep over his eyes. He had arrived, though he did not know it, at the last strange country of the voyage. The country was Scheria, land of the Phaeacians, and it was something new on this journey. Not monsters, not witches, not cannibals, but a civilized, wealthy, slightly smug seafaring people, beloved of the gods, whose ships were the marvel of the world, needing no steersman, finding any port on earth by thought alone. Their king was Alcinous. Their queen Arete was honoured, unusually, as wisely as any man, and their capital had harbours, temples, an assembly place, and gardens that bore fruit the whole year round. After 3 years among the impossible, Odysseus had washed up in front of something merely wonderful, a functioning society. His introduction to it came through a teenager with laundry. The Princess Nausicaa, prompted by a dream Athena sent, had driven the palace washing down to the river that morning with her maids, and after the work they bathed and played ball on the beach, and a stray throw into the river raised a shout that woke the sleeper under the olive trees. What followed is Greek epic's finest comedy of manners. Odysseus emerged from the bushes, naked as a lion, salt-crusted and terrifying, holding a leafy branch in front of himself for decency, and every girl on that beach scattered screaming except one. Nausicaa stood her ground, and the shipwrecked politician facing her produced, on no sleep and an empty stomach, one of the most skilful speeches of his life, opening with the unimprovable line, "Are you a goddess or a mortal?" He compared her to Artemis, blessed her future husband, and asked for a rag and directions to town, all while maintaining a safe and respectful distance, which under the circumstances was the most persuasive part of the speech. It worked, as his speeches usually did. Bathed, oiled, and dressed in clothes from the royal laundry, made taller and more splendid by Athena for good measure, he so impressed the princess that she remarked to her maids, wistfully, that she wished her husband might be such a man. She gave him shrewd local advice. Enter the city separately to avoid gossip, go straight past the king, and clasp the knees of Queen Arete, whose favour decided everything in that house. He did exactly that, walking into the torchlit hall through a mist Athena wrapped around him, and materializing, to the astonishment of the court, at the queen's feet. The Phaeacians received the nameless stranger with textbook hospitality, food first, questions later, and there Odysseus stayed for days, a guest of honour with no name, while the court entertained him. And here Homer builds one of his most cunning scenes. The blind court bard, Demodocus, sang for the company, and what he sang, with all the world's stories to choose from, was the Trojan War, the quarrel of Odysseus and Achilles, the famous names. And the anonymous guest at the feast pulled his cloak over his head and wept into it, secretly, at hearing his own life performed as entertainment. Twice it happened, and the second time the bard sang the story of the wooden horse itself, and Odysseus dissolved, Homer says, the way a woman weeps over the body of her husband killed defending his city, which is to say the poem compares the sacker of Troy to Troy's own widows, and lets the comparison sit there, unexplained, forever. King Alcinous saw the weeping, stopped the music, and asked the question that had been politely postponed for days. "Stranger, who are you?" And with that, the mask came off at last. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes," he said, "known to all men for my schemes. My fame reaches heaven, and my home is Ithaca." And then, for 4 books of the poem, he told them everything: the Cyclones, the lotus, the Cyclops, the winds, the giants, Circe, the dead, the Sirens, the strait, the cattle, Calypso, all of it, the entire middle of the Odyssey. Everything you and I have heard of the wanderings, we heard the way the Phaeacians heard it from Odysseus' own mouth at a feast after dinner. Homer, with a storyteller's slyness, made his hero the narrator of his own legend, and left every listener since to wonder, quietly, how much of it the most famous liar in Greece may have improved in the telling. The Phaeacians, spellbound, did not merely believe him, they paid him. Alcinous called for gifts from every noble, bronze and gold and fine cloth, until the stranger who had crawled ashore naked possessed more treasure than his share of Troy's plunder, the plunder at the bottom of the sea with his ships. Then they made good on their name as the ferrymen of the world. A ship was launched, the gifts stowed, and Odysseus, after farewells in which Nausicaa asked only that he remember her, since she had saved him first, lay down on a blanket on the deck. The magic ship ran west through the night faster than a hawk, and sleep took him, deep, sweet, and, the poet says, most like death, the last sleep of the voyage. He did not wake when the ship touched Ithaca. The Phaeacian crew carried the sleeping king ashore, laid him gently on the sand of his own island, stacked the treasure by an olive tree, and rowed away. After 20 years, 10 of war and 10 of wandering, Odysseus came home unconscious and missed it. Poseidon exacted one last toll, not from him, but from his helpers. As the Phaeacian ship entered its home harbour, the god turned it to stone with one blow of his open hand, a ship-shaped rock in sight of the city, as a permanent notice regarding the ferrying of his enemies. Alcinous, watching, remembered an old prophecy and instituted a policy change on the spot regarding rides for strangers. The last door on the sea road closed. On the beach of Ithaca, the sleeping man began to stir. He was about to wake up in his own country, and fail to recognize it. The beggar of Ithaca. Odysseus woke on the sand and did not know where he was. Athena had wrapped the coast in mist, partly for his protection and partly, one suspects, because she enjoyed what came next. He looked around at the harbour, the olive tree, the hills of his own childhood, and groaned aloud that the Phaeacians had cheated him and dumped him in yet another strange land. And he counted his treasure to see what they had stolen, which was nothing. There is something perfect in it. The man had imagined this homecoming for 20 years, and when it finally happened, he slept through the arrival and then failed to recognize the destination. A young shepherd appeared through the mist, and Odysseus, instantly and by reflex, lied to him. Asked who he was, he improvised an entire biography on the spot. A Cretan fugitive, a killing over plunder, a passage bought on a Phoenician ship, detail after plausible detail. The shepherd listened to the whole performance, and then smiled and changed shape. It was Athena. Her delight, as she dropped the disguise, is one of the warmest moments in the epic. Anyone who could out-trick you, she said, in effect, would have to be a master thief among gods. You incorrigible schemer, you would keep lying in your own country. This is why I cannot abandon you. You are just like me. Then she scattered the mist, and showed him the harbour and the long ridge of the mountain, and Odysseus knelt down and kissed the earth of Ithaca at last. What followed was a war council between the goddess and the man, crouched against the trunk of the olive tree. She told him the situation in his palace, the 108 suitors, the pressure on Penelope, the plot against his son, and they settled the strategy that governs everything from here to the end. No open arrival. Agamemnon's ghost had given the warning in Hades, and here it became doctrine. He would enter his own kingdom as an intelligence operation, identify who had stayed loyal through 20 years, and strike only when everything was in place. To make it possible, Athena worked her transformation. She withered the skin on his supple limbs, dimmed his eyes, stripped the brown hair from his head, and dressed him in a filthy tunic, a mangy deerskin, and a beggar's staff and pouch. The king of Ithaca became an old vagrant, invisible in the one way that matters, beneath notice. His first stop, on Athena's instruction, was not the palace. It was a pig farm in the hills, and the man who ran it deserves his place in this story. Eumaeus, the swineherd, a slave, had been keeping the absent king's herds honestly for 20 years while the suitors devoured them from the other end, and his greeting to the anonymous old beggar at his gate is the moral centre of the whole poem. He beat off his own dogs to save the stranger, brought him in, fed him from the best of what he had, and explained himself with a line that has outlived empires. "All strangers and beggars," he said, "come from Zeus, and a gift, though small, is welcome." The disguised king spent days in that hut, testing the man from every angle, and found nothing but loyalty. Eumaeus spoke of his lost master with such grief and love, refusing to believe travellers' tales of his survival because too many liars had traded on the queen's hope already, that Odysseus, listening from inside the disguise, was hearing his own eulogy from the one audience that could not be performing for him. There are worse ways to learn what your life amounted to. Meanwhile, the poem's other thread came home. Telemachus had been abroad these past weeks, and his journey matters enough to tell briefly. Prodded by Athena at the very start of everything, the boy who had grown up fatherless had sailed to the mainland to seek news, and the trip had been his education. In sandy Pylos, old King Nestor had received him with overwhelming hospitality and war stories. In Sparta, Menelaus and Helen themselves, restored and uneasily domestic, had told him of his father's exploits, and Menelaus shared the one piece of hard intelligence in the whole Greek world, gathered from a shape-shifting sea god in Egypt, that Odysseus was alive, held on an island by a nymph. The boy who left Ithaca a passive, hopeless teenager was returning as something else, a young man who had sat with kings, been recognised as his father's son, and learned to speak and act, which was fortunate, because the suitors had laid an ambush for him, a ship of armed men waiting in the strait to murder him on the way home. Warned by Athena, he sailed a different course by night, landed on a far beach, and, as the goddess arranged it, walked up to the hut of Eumaeus while the swineherd and the old beggar sat at breakfast. Eumaeus wept over the boy like a father over a son come back from the dead, which tells you who had actually raised him. And then the swineherd was sent off to the palace with a message for Penelope, and the beggar and the young man were alone. Athena appeared, visible only to Odysseus, and touched him, and the disguise fell away, the rags becoming clean clothes, the years dropping off, and Telemachus, seeing the transformation, concluded reasonably that he was facing a god. "No," said Odysseus, and the line lands after 20 years of ocean. "No, God, I am your father, for whose sake you have grieved and suffered and endured the violence of men." Telemachus did not believe him at first, which is its own kind of heartbreak, and then belief arrived all at once, and the two of them broke down together, crying, Homer says, more piercingly than eagles robbed of their young, and they would have wept until sunset if the work had not been waiting, because the reunion turned, almost immediately, into a staff meeting. Odysseus laid out the arithmetic. 2 of them, over 100 suitors. Telemachus, to his credit, raised the obvious objection that the odds were insane, and his father answered with the only allies that mattered, Athena and Zeus. The plan was set. The beggar disguise would go back on. Telemachus would return to the palace and reveal nothing, not even to his mother. At the right moment, on a signal, he would quietly remove the weapons that hung on the walls of the great hall and lock them in the storeroom, leaving arms for just the 2 of them. And no matter what abuse the disguised king suffered in his own house, the son would swallow his rage and let it happen. So the next morning, Telemachus went home to his anxious mother, and behind him, along the mountain path, came the swineherd and a broken-down old beggar, walking toward the palace of Odysseus. At the courtyard gate, they passed a rubbish heap, and on the rubbish heap something stirred. It was a dog, an old dying dog, abandoned on the dung, too weak to rise, crawling with vermin. His name was Argos. Odysseus had bred and trained him as a puppy 20 years before, and sailed for Troy before ever hunting him. The young men had taken him out in the old days, after wild goats and hares, and then the years had passed and no one cared, and now he lay on the heap at the gate. And as the beggar approached, the old dog knew him. Through the rags, the wrinkles, the 20 years, past a disguise woven by a goddess that would fool every human being in the palace, Argos knew his master. He had no strength to come closer. He dropped his ears and wagged his tail. Odysseus saw it, and could not react. One gesture toward the dog and the disguise, the plan, the lives of his family were at risk. He turned his face away from Argos and flicked away a tear where Eumaeus could not see, and asked, in a stranger's casual voice, whose dog that was lying there, and had he been any good in his day. "Fine dog once," said the swineherd, "the fastest thing in the woods before his master sailed and died far away, and now the women neglect him," and they walked on past, into the courtyard, master and dog pretending, for the mission, not to know each other. And Argos, says Homer, having seen Odysseus again in the 20th year, closed his eyes and died. Of all the deaths in this poem, the warriors and kings and crews, it is the dog on the rubbish heap that readers have never gotten over. He asked for nothing, waited without being asked to, and held on, it seems, for exactly one thing. 20 years of the whole epic's meaning, compressed into one wag of a dying tale. The beggar wiped his face, gathered his rags, and stepped over his own threshold into a hall full of the men who were eating his kingdom and courting his wife. Every one of them was armed with youth, numbers, and confidence. He was armed with a stick and a lie. It was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. But they had a few days left before they found that out. Inside the occupied palace, the great hall that Odysseus entered as a beggar was the heart of his own house, and it is worth walking through it slowly, as he did, because the world it belonged to is one we can actually reconstruct. Archaeologists have dug palaces of this age out of the Greek earth, at Mycenae, at Pylos, at Sirens, and their centrepiece was always the same room Homer describes, the Megaron, a long rectangular hall with a great round hearth burning at the centre, 4 columns around it holding up the roof, a vent above for the smoke, and the king's seat against the wall. Feasting benches lined the sides, the walls were plastered and painted, and the floor of Odysseus's hall, at this particular moment in history, was crowded with 108 uninvited men eating his pigs. Since we have arrived, at last, at a Bronze Age palace in something like peacetime, let us take a moment to look at the people of this world, from the top of it to the bottom, because the poem itself is built out of their differences. At the top sat the kings and the landed nobles, the basileus, men like Odysseus and the suitors' fathers, whose wealth was counted not in coin, which did not yet exist, but in land, livestock, bronze, and stored treasure, tripods, cauldrons, and fine cloth given and received as gifts. Their days, as Homer paints them, were feasting, hunting, athletics, assembly politics, and war, and their wives ran large productive households and commanded the storerooms. Such men wore a tunic of fine wool or linen, with a great cloak pinned at the shoulder, and a princess dressed in layered flounced skirts and bright-dyed fabrics, gold at the ears and wrists. Below them came the farmers and herdsmen with their own plots, the craftsmen, smiths, potters, and shipwrights, and a class the poem treats with special respect, the travelling professionals, the seer, the healer, the carpenter, and the bard, welcome at any door because their skills moved with them. Below these were the thetes, free but landless labourers who hired out for wages and whom Achilles' ghost named as the very bottom of free existence. And below them the slaves, mostly women taken in raids, grinding the endless daily grain, weaving, carrying water, though a trusted few, like Eumaeus with his pigs and the old nurse Euryclea, ran their departments with real authority and were spoken of almost as family. Everyone, high and low, lived on the same trinity, barley and wheat for bread and porridge, wine always cut with water, and olive oil for food, lamp and skin, with figs, cheese, onions, and legumes alongside. The endless roast meat of Homer's feasts was the luxury of the great house, and even there it marked an occasion. Meat meant sacrifice, and sacrifice meant the gods got the smoke and the savour while the mortals, by a convenient arrangement negotiated in myth by Prometheus himself, got the dinner. Into this world, at the bottom of it, stepped its rightful owner, dressed as the lowest thing a free man could be, and began systematically begging from the men at his own tables. It was reconnaissance disguised as poverty. Moving man to man with his palm out, he was measuring each suitor, sorting, Homer says, the decent from the vicious, though the sorting would change nothing in the end, and the suitors obliged him by identifying themselves. Their ringleader was Antinous, the most arrogant of the pack, and where the others tossed the old beggar scraps, Antinous picked up a footstool and threw it, striking him at the base of the right shoulder. The hall went quiet at that. Even by the suitors' standards, striking a beggar was dangerous business, for exactly the reason one of them nervously spoke aloud. The gods, everyone knew, walked the earth disguised as strangers and beggars, observing the justice and violence of men. It is the one moment the suitors brush against the truth of their situation, and they go back to their wine. The house tested its master too. A genuine beggar named Iris, the palace's resident sponger, resented the competition and challenged the newcomer to a fist fight, and the suitors, delighted, made a sport of it and put up a prize of goat sausages. Odysseus stripped for the bout, revealing rather more thigh and shoulder than the rags had advertised, hit Iris once, carefully, below the ear, and dragged him out by the leg to prop against the courtyard wall. The suitors laughed themselves helpless and congratulated the old fellow. They had just watched their executioner warm up, and they thought it was dinner theatre. Upstairs, meanwhile, the poem turns to the person this entire war of nerves is actually about. Penelope, 20 years into a defence with no relief in sight, chose this evening to descend into the hall, radiant, and announced to the suitors that the time of decision was approaching, and that proper suitors, by the way, ought to bring gifts rather than eat a woman's house bare. The suitors scrambled to send home for robes and gold, and Odysseus, watching from his corner in his rags, rejoiced quietly at the performance. Whether she somehow sensed something that night, or whether 20 years with this woman simply taught him what her manoeuvring looked like, the beggar in the corner recognized a fellow professional. Their interview came late that night, by the fire, when the hall had emptied, the queen and the stranger, husband and wife, one of them knowing it. She asked who he was, and he spun a Cretan tale again, but this time laced with truth, claiming to have hosted Odysseus himself long ago, and describing, to prove it, the very clothes and the golden brooch her own hands had chosen for him 20 years before. Penelope wept at the description. The snow melting on the mountains is Homer's image, and the man who caused the tears sat beside her, and in that hall of enemies could not comfort her, keeping his eyes, the poem says, hard as horn or iron behind their lids. He fed her hope in measured doses, swearing that Odysseus was alive, near, and coming. She could not let herself believe it. Hope, for this woman, had become the enemy, the thing that had been picking her wounds open for 2 decades. Then she did him a kindness that nearly ended everything. She called for the old nurse to wash the honoured stranger's feet, and the nurse was Euryclea, who had raised Odysseus from infancy. He realised the danger a half-second too late. Above his knee ran a long scar, taken in boyhood from a boar's tusk while hunting on Parnassus with his grandfather, and every servant of the old household knew it. He twisted toward the shadows, but the old woman's hands found the scar in the water, and she knew it instantly, and knew him, and her eyes flew to Penelope's face, and her lips opened to cry out. Odysseus's hand closed on her throat. "Mother," he whispered, "you will destroy me. Not a word, or you die with the rest." The old woman, iron under the wrinkles, swore herself silent, and finished washing the feet of the boy she had nursed, saying nothing, while the queen sat a few steps away, wrapped in her own sorrow, noticing none of it, because Athena, the poem says, turned her thoughts aside. Before they parted, Penelope told the stranger 2 things. The first was her dream, 20 geese in the yard slaughtered by an eagle, and the eagle speaking with her husband's voice, and the beggar assured her the dream needed no interpreter. The second was a decision. She could hold out no longer, she said. Tomorrow she would set the suitors a contest, her husband's old game. She would bring out his great bow and line up 12 axes as he used to, and the man who could string the bow and shoot an arrow through the 12 would have her, and she would leave this house forever. The beggar leaned forward and told her to hold the contest without delay. Odysseus, of the many devices he promised, would be there before any of these men ever strung that bow. That night, the king lay sleepless in the entryway of his own palace, listening to the giggling of the disloyal maidservants slipping out to the suitors' beds. His heart, Homer says, growling inside him like a dog over her pups, and he slapped his own chest and spoke to his heart directly. Endure, heart. You endured worse the day the Cyclops ate your comrades. And the heart obeyed and endured and waited for morning, which was going to be quite a day, the contest of the bow. The day of the contest arrived dressed as an ordinary day, a feast day of Apollo, as it happened, the archer god, which no one in the hall seems to have found ominous, though they were about to. The suitors trooped in as usual, slaughtered the animals as usual, and settled to their eating, and the omens began stacking up around them unnoticed. A seer among them, Theoclymenus, looked at the laughing company and suddenly saw them as they would shortly be, shrouded in night, the walls dripping blood, the porch full of ghosts hurrying down to darkness, and he said so, out loud, and left the building. The suitors laughed and suggested the man needed an escort, since he apparently could not tell day from night. There is a special quality to the laughter of men whose luck has already run out, and Homer lets us listen to it all morning. Then Penelope went to the storeroom. Homer slows the poem down for this, and we should too. She took the bent bronze key with its ivory handle, opened the doors of the innermost chamber where the treasures lay, and lifted down from its peg the great bow of Odysseus in its shining case, a legendary weapon with a history of its own, given to the young Odysseus by a friend later murdered by Heracles, and never taken to Troy, kept at home all these years in memory of that friendship. The queen sat down with the case across her knees, took out her husband's bow, and cried over it for a long time. Then she dried her eyes, walked down into the hall full of feasting enemies, and announced the terms. The bow of Odysseus, 12 axes set in a line as he used to set them. Whoever strings the bow most easily and shoots through all 12, I will follow him from this house. Telemachus dug the trench and planted the 12 axes in a dead straight line, to everyone's surprise, including possibly his own, and the contest began. Now, about that bow, because the physics of the scene is the whole point of the scene. This was a composite recurve bow, a laminate of wood, horn and sinew, and such bows, when unstrung, curl backward against their draw direction. Stringing one is a feat of technique as much as strength, requiring the archer to bend the whole stiff spring of the weapon against its nature far enough to slip the loop over the nock, and a heavy war bow of this kind simply cannot be strung by an untrained man, however large his shoulders. The suitors were about to take a public examination, designed by the absent examiner, in a skill exactly none of them possessed. Whether Penelope understood this perfectly well is a question the poem leaves glinting quietly on the table. The first suitor to try, a decent one, as it happens, could not budge it. The bow, Homer says, wore out his hands as he worked it uselessly back and forth. Antinous, sensing a public relations problem developing, called for grease and a fire, and the suitors warmed and larded the weapon and tried it in relays, and one after another, the leading men of Ithaca strained, sweated, and failed in front of the woman they proposed to carry off. Eventually even Antinous surrendered to prudence, proposing they adjourn the contest to another day, today being, after all, the feast of Apollo, and who shoots arrows on the archer's holiday. It was gracefully done. It was also, though he could not know it, the last good idea of his life. because while the nobility failed at the bow, the beggar in the corner had been running the final errand of his long game. He had slipped out to the courtyard after two men he had spent days quietly evaluating, Eumaeus the swineherd and Philoetius the cowherd, both grieving for their lost master within his hearing, and put the question to them plainly. If Odysseus were suddenly to appear right now, whose side would you take? Both answered without hesitation, and Odysseus said, "Then look at me," and showed them the scar. The two herdsmen wept over him, kissing his head and shoulders until he had to shush them, and received their orders. Eumaeus was to put the bow into the beggar's hands, whatever anyone shouted, then tell the women to bolt the doors of their quarters and stay inside no matter what they heard. Philoetius was to lock and lash the courtyard gate. The exits of the great hall of Odysseus were quietly closing, one by one, while its occupants argued about archery. Back inside, the beggar spoke up. "Just to try my hands," he said, "to see if there is any of the old strength left in these rags." The suitors erupted, Antinous threatening him with mutilation, but Penelope insisted the stranger be given his chance. Was he not a guest? Telemachus then did something new. He overrode his own mother, in public, sending her upstairs to her weaving with the crisp announcement that the bow was men's business and his above all, since the power in this house was his. Penelope, startled, obeyed, taking the stairs to her room, where Athena poured sleep over her. She would sleep, mercifully, through everything that followed. And Eumaeus, running a gauntlet of abuse, carried the great bow across the hall and set it in the beggar's hands. The hall settled, jeering, to watch the tramp embarrass himself. And Homer gives us the moment through their eyes, in one of the finest similes he ever built. The beggar turned the bow over and over, this way and that, checking whether worms had eaten the horn in its master's absence, taking his time, while the suitors joked that the old fellow must be a bow fancier or a dealer. Then, the way a singer, a man skilled at the lyre, stretches a new string easily around a peg, without effort, without strain. Exactly so did Odysseus string the great bow, one motion. Then he plucked the string with his right hand to test it, and it sang under his touch like a swallow's note. The suitors' faces changed colour. "Altogether," Homer says, and at that precise moment Zeus thundered out of a clear sky, and the beggar smiled at the omen. He was already holding an arrow. He did not stand up, did not pose, did not even set his feet. Sitting on his stool, he laid the shaft on the bridge of the bow, drew string and notched arrow straight back, and sent it through the helve sockets of all 12 axes. First shot, end to end, not grazing one. Then, into the silence, he spoke to his son. "The stranger has not disgraced you," he said. "My strength is unbroken, whatever these gentlemen thought of me. And now it is time to serve these Achaeans their supper, while there is still light, and after it, some other entertainment, with song and lyre, the crowning graces of a feast. It is the coldest dinner invitation in Western literature, and only 2 people in the room understood it." Telemachus heard the signal, hung his sword at his side, took his spear in his fist, and moved to stand beside the ragged man on the stool, armed and glittering. Odysseus stripped off his rags in one motion, and leapt up onto the great threshold, the high stone door-sill commanding the whole hall, the bow in his hand and the quiver's arrows poured out at his feet. "Now," he said, "that game is over, and there is another target, one no man has hit before." And every door was locked, and the walls, thanks to the sun's quiet work with the armoury, hung bare of weapons, and 108 men looked up from their tables at the archer, standing between them and the only way out, and understood, at last, whose house they had been eating in, the reckoning and the olive-tree bed. The first arrow went to Antinous. He was lifting a golden 2-handled cup of wine to his lips, and death, Homer observes, was the last thing on his mind. For who at a feast, among so many companions, would imagine one man attacking a crowd? The arrow took him through the throat, and the cup fell, and the suitors sprang up in a roar, scanning the bare walls where the shields and spears had always hung, and shouting at the beggar that he had just killed the noblest young man in Ithaca by accident, and would die for it. They still thought it was a mishap. Odysseus corrected them. "You dogs," he said. "You never thought I would come home from Troy. You wasted my house, courted my wife while I lived, and feared neither the gods nor any human vengeance. Now the cords of destruction are fastened around every one of you." The suitors' spokesman, a smooth man named Eurymachus, tried the only two tools he had. First negotiation, blaming everything on the conveniently dead Antinous and offering full restitution, 20 oxen apiece, bronze and gold, until the king's heart was soothed. Odysseus refused it flatly. "Not for your whole inheritances," he said. "Would these hands stop before every trespass is paid for?" Then Eurymachus tried the sword, calling the others to charge with tables for shields, and got as far as one step. The battle that followed filled the hall, and the poem does not rush it. Odysseus shooting man after man from the threshold while the arrows lasted. Telemachus running to the storeroom for armour and spears for their side. The loyal swineherd and cowherd fighting beside their master. 4 men against the mob. There was one breach, a treacherous goatherd who found the armoury door and began arming suitors, 12 of them, before he was caught in the act. Trust, and hauled up a pillar to wait for later. And there was one intervention. Athena joined the fight, first in disguise, then raising her aegis, her terrible storm shield, from the rafters, and the suitors stampeded down the hall like cattle under a maddening fly, and the 4 hunters followed them, striking, and the floor of the great hall ran and smoked with blood. Homer, who had watched men die at Troy for one whole epic already, spares nothing here, and permits exactly 2 survivors. The bard, Phemius, who had sung for the suitors under compulsion, spared because a singer is sacred, and the herald Medon, who had minded the young Telemachus, found hiding under an ox-hide and hauled out trembling. Everyone else, all 106 remaining, ended in the hall they had feasted in. The priest among them, who clasped the king's knees and begged, was refused, on the grounds that a chaplain to that company had certainly prayed for the king's death. When it was done, Odysseus stood among the bodies, spattered, Homer says, like a lion come from feeding, and forbade the old nurse her cry of triumph over the dead. "It is unholy," he said, "to gloat over slain men. The gods and their own hard deeds destroyed these." Then came the grimmest housekeeping in ancient literature. The 12 maidservants who had betrayed the household were made to carry out the corpses and scrub the tables and the floor, and were then, on Telemachus's order, hanged in the courtyard, and the treacherous goatherd was butchered. The poem reports it without flinching and without apology. This was Bronze Age justice in a Bronze Age house, and the Odyssey was never a gentle story. It was a story about the price of things. The hall was fumigated with sulphur and fire, and the loyal women poured out of their quarters and embraced their master. And upstairs, at last, old Eurycleia climbed to the queen's chamber, cackling with joy to deliver the news she had been strangling for days. "Wake up, child, he is here. Odysseus is home, and the suitors are dead." And Penelope did not believe her. This is the last movement of the poem, and it may be the finest. She came down to the hall and sat across the firelight from the man everyone swore was her husband, and studied him in silence, recognizing him one moment, the next seeing only a stranger in bad clothes. Telemachus scolded her. No other wife in the world would hold back from a husband 20 years gone, and she answered that if this man was truly Odysseus, the 2 of them had ways of knowing each other, secret signs hidden from everyone else. Odysseus himself, bathed now and made splendid by Athena, took his turn at persuasion and got nowhere. She had spent 20 years as the most courted widow in Greece, holding off 100 liars, and she was not going to fail the final exam out of longing. So she set her trap, as casually as her husband ever set one. "Very well," she said to the nurse. "Make up his bed for him, outside the bridal chamber, the sturdy bed he himself built. Move it out for the stranger." And Odysseus detonated. "What man has moved my bed? That bed cannot be moved. I built it myself, and I built it around a living olive tree that grew in the courtyard. I trimmed the trunk and made it the bedpost, and raised the chamber around it, and inlaid it with gold and silver and ivory, and no power short of a god could shift it without cutting the tree through. That is our sign, woman. Is the bed still rooted, or has someone cut it loose? It was the password, and only the true man could have spoken it, and only by being provoked past his cunning into honest outrage, which was, of course, the design. Her knees went loose where she sat. She ran to him, threw her arms around his neck, kissed his face, and asked him not to be angry, explaining herself in words that closed 20 years like a healing wound. Do not be angry that I held back. I was always afraid some man would come and cheat me with words. There are so many schemers in the world, and Homer reaches for his final simile and gives the homecoming, at last, its image. As welcome as land is to swimmers whose ship Poseidon has wrecked, and who strike out from the grey water for the shore, so welcome was her husband to her, and she could not let her white arms go from his neck. The poet has spent the whole epic wrecking this man at sea. In the last embrace, he makes Penelope the shore. Athena, in a gesture of pure grace, held back the dawn, keeping night in place while the two of them talked, telling each other 20 years, her weaving and her siege, his whole catalogue of wanderings, and Homer notes that he told her everything, and this time we believe him. There were loose ends beyond that room, and the poem ties them briskly. In the morning, Odysseus walked out to the farm, and found his father, Laertes, the old king, digging in his orchard in patched rags, and the son who had tricked everyone in the Mediterranean could not resist one final test, questioning the old man as a stranger until his father's grief broke him, and then the scar came out. And the trees came out, the pear and apple and fig trees Laertes had given him as a boy, counted and named, and the old man fainted into his son's arms. The families of the dead suitors came in arms for revenge, as they were bound to, and battle was joined for exactly one casualty before Athena, on Zeus's instruction, stopped the feud with a shout and imposed peace on Ithaca, a peace with amnesty on both sides, which is where the Odyssey, having opened with a household in chaos, closes with an island at rest. The poem ends there, but its journey never has. For nearly 3,000 years this story has been the story, the template underneath half the tales our species tells. Every long way home, every clever underdog, every faithful wait, every wanderer's return borrows from it, mostly without knowing. Its hero's name became a common noun in 100 languages, an odyssey, any long difficult journey towards something that matters. Sailors, soldiers and emigrants have carried it with them. Philosophers have argued with it. Poets from Virgil to our own century have rewritten it. And through all of it, the heart of the thing has stayed exactly where Homer left it, in a man on a beach refusing eternity because it was not home, in a woman unravelling a shroud by lamplight, in a dog's tail moving on a rubbish heap, and in a bed built around a living tree, still rooted, after everything. They found each other again, the two cleverest people in Greece, and the tree held, and the story was over. And now, gently, let it be over for you as well. There is no more sea to cross tonight. The hall is quiet, the fires are banked, and every ship is home. If you are still awake, you do not have to be. Another journey is waiting on your screen whenever you want it, and it will keep. If tonight's voyage carried you somewhere good, you can like the video and subscribe, or leave a thought in the comments, and I will read it in the morning. But that is tomorrow's business. For now, let your body sink a little heavier into the bed, unclench your jaw, let your breathing slow down all on its own. Close your eyes and let the sound of the water fade. Sleep is a kind of homecoming too, and yours is right here. Good night and sweet dreams.